There is a particular quality to ancient stone, the way it holds the memory of everything that has ever rested against it, every hand that has ever traced its surface, every whispered word that has drifted through the cool air surrounding it. Imagine for a moment standing at the edge of something vast, not a cliff, not an ocean, but time itself. You are standing at the threshold of a world that once turned on the deliberations of a single, extraordinary room, a room of marble and shadow, of lamplight and ambition, of voices that rose and fell like tides against the walls of an empire. There is a hill in the center of what was once the greatest city on earth. The Romans called it the Capitoline. And from its gentle slope on a clear morning long ago, one could look down upon a valley that had been transformed, slowly, lovingly, over the course of centuries, into something almost impossible to comprehend, the Forum Romanum. Even the name moves slowly through the mind, like smoke across still water. Forum Romanum. It was the beating heart of Rome, the place where merchants and priests and generals and slaves all moved through the same sacred air, beneath the same pale sky, around the same ancient stones. And at one end of this forum, set apart from the noise and the commerce and the daily motion of Roman life, there stood a building that carried a weight no architect could have planned for. The Curia. It did not announce itself with great towers or dramatic columns. It was, just in many ways, a modest structure, long and rectangular, its interior lit by high windows that let in slanted bars of afternoon light. But within those walls, for nearly 1,000 years, the course of the known world was shaped, debated, argued over, and decided. This was where the Senate met. And the Senate was everything. It is easy, perhaps, to think of ancient institutions as fixed things, monuments as unchanging as the stone they were built from. But the Roman Senate was never fixed. It breathed. It expanded and contracted with the pressures of each era. It was, in its truest form, a living argument, a conversation that Rome was having with itself about power and virtue, and who deserved to hold the fate of millions in their hands. To walk into that building, even in imagination, is to feel something settle over the shoulders like a heavy cloak. The air carries the faint trace of oil from the lamps that burned along the walls. The marble floor beneath the feet is cool and faintly luminous, the color of old cream. The benches arranged along each side of the chamber are worn smooth from generations of togas, of fidgeting hands, of men who sat in this very place and understood, or perhaps only half understood, that what was said here today would ripple outward across the Mediterranean world for decades to come. There is no grand spectacle waiting here, no thunder, no golden thrones, just men and words and the slow machinery of collective decision. The presiding magistrate, a consul most often, one of the two men elected each year to lead the republic, would take his place at the front of the chamber. The senators would arrange themselves along the tiered benches, the most senior members closest to the front, the most junior lingering toward the back, near the great wooden doors that opened onto the bustle of the forum beyond. And then the debate would begin. There is something almost hypnotic about imagining it, the layered voices, the careful rhetoric, the pauses between arguments where a man might look up at the light falling through those high windows and gather his thoughts before speaking again. These were men trained from boyhood in the arts of persuasion, men who could hold an entire chamber in silence with a single well-chosen phrase, men who knew that in this room the sword was secondary to the sentence. that a well-constructed argument could accomplish what an entire legion might struggle to achieve. And yet, for all its grandeur, for all the weight it carried in the history of the world, the Senate was also deeply, remarkably human. There were petty jealousies, old family rivalries that stretched back generations, playing out in the carefully worded insults embedded within perfectly polished speeches. There were alliances forged over dinner the night before, quietly unraveling by mid-morning. There were men of towering brilliance and men of breathtaking mediocrity, sitting side by side on the same worn benches, all of them technically equal in their right to speak, and all of them always aware that they were participants in something larger than themselves. The Romans had a deep and almost reverential relationship with their own history. They believed that the past was not merely something that had happened, it was something that continued to happen, something that needed to be tended and honored and consulted, the way one might consult a beloved elder whose wisdom had not diminished with age. The Senate embodied this belief more perfectly than any other institution in the Roman world. When a senator rose to speak, he was not only speaking for himself or even for his constituents, he was speaking as a link in a long, unbroken chain, one that stretched back to the earliest days of the city, to the kings and the founders, to the mythic figures whose names were still invoked with something approaching awe, even centuries after their deaths. To be a senator was to carry all of that. It was to sit in the same chamber where Cicero had once held the fate of the Republic, together with nothing but words, where Caesar had sat before he crossed the Rubicon, where Augustus had carefully, quietly dismantled the very system that had shaped him, replacing it with something new while insisting always that nothing had changed at all. The light through the high windows shifts. The afternoon deepens toward evening, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the Forum, beyond the 7 hills, the great city breathes its slow, enormous breath, and the Senate remains, not as a fixed thing, not as a monument, but as a question that Rome was always asking itself, a question about how power should be held and who should hold it, and what obligations the powerful owed to those beneath them. It is a question that never fully found its answer, and perhaps that is why it still drifts through the mind, slowly, like dust motes turning in a shaft of ancient light. The story of the Senate does not begin in marble. It begins in something far older and far simpler, in the instinct common to nearly every human gathering since the earliest fires, to seek the counsel of those who have lived longest, seen the most, and carry within them the accumulated weight of experience. The Latin word is telling, senatus. It flows from a senex, meaning old man or elder. And so the very name of this institution whispers its original purpose. It was not at its heart a parliament or a court or a legislature in any modern sense of those words. It was, first and most essentially, a council of elders. Rome, in its earliest form, was not the empire we imagine when we close our eyes and picture it. It was something far more tentative, a collection of settlements clustered on and around those famous 7 hills above the Tiber River, surrounded by neighbors who were, more often than not, rivals or enemies. The Etruscans to the north, the Latins to the south, the Sabines to the east, all of them watching, always watching, as this small community of herdsmen and farmers and traders slowly, stubbornly, began to cohere into something more. The Romans themselves told stories about how it all began, Romulus, the legendary founder, the child suckled by the wolf, the man who drew a line in the earth and called it the boundary of a city, was said to have created the first Senate almost as an afterthought. He chose 100 men drawn from the most prominent families of the earliest Roman community and gathered them around him as advisors. These were the patres, the fathers, and their descendants would carry that title with enormous pride for centuries to come. To be a patrician in Rome was to trace your lineage back to those original 100 men who had sat with Romulus in the very first council. This is legend, of course, and Rome was never shy about wrapping its origins in the warm, golden light of myth. But beneath the legend, historians find something recognizable and real. In the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, as Rome was still governed by kings, the Senate functioned as an advisory body, a group of senior aristocrats whose influence derived not from any formal legal power, but from the collective weight of their prestige, their family connections, their wealth, and the simple, formidable authority that comes from having lived long and survived much. The king could consult them or ignore them, but ignoring them was rarely wise. There is a phrase the Romans used that captures this dynamic beautifully: auctoritas. It is one of those Latin words that resists clean translation because it describes something more complex than any single English word can hold. Authority, yes, but not the authority of force or formal office. Rather the authority of reputation, of moral weight, of the invisible but very real power that accumulates around a person or an institution that has consistently demonstrated wisdom and integrity over a long period of time. The early Senate had auctoritas in abundance, and so even kings, proud, powerful, sometimes tyrannical men, found themselves drawn into consultation with it, if only because the alternative was to rule a city whose most influential inhabitants had turned quietly, implacably against them. The last king of Rome understood this lesson too late. Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was, according to Roman tradition, a ruler of genuine ability and considerable ambition. He extended Roman territory, built great monuments, negotiated treaties with neighboring peoples, but he ruled with a contempt for the old aristocratic families that bordered on recklessness. He executed senators without trial. He governed without consultation, without the careful rituals of shared power that Roman elites had come to expect as their birthright. And in 509 before the Common Era, a date the Romans would remember with something approaching religious reverence, he was expelled, not by an army, not by a foreign invasion, but by the very families whose counsel he had scorned. What replaced him was something entirely new in the ancient world. The Romans called it the res publica, the public thing, the commonwealth, and it represented a genuinely radical reimagining of how a city could be governed. Power would no longer rest in the hands of a single hereditary monarch. Instead, it would be distributed carefully, deliberately, with an almost anxious attention to the danger of any one man accumulating too much. 2 consuls would be elected each year, 2, always 2, so that each could check the ambitions of the other. They would hold power for only 12 months, after which they would return to private life and the judgment of their fellow citizens. And above them, beneath them, woven through every institution of the new republic like a golden thread, the Senate. In the early republic, the Senate's role expanded enormously. What had been an advisory council to kings became something far more central, the primary governing body of a state that was, year by year, growing larger and more complex and more consequential. The consuls were powerful, yes, but they were temporary. The Senate was permanent. Senators served for life, unless removed through the periodic review known as the census. And so, while elected magistrates came and went, with each passing year, the Senate accumulated continuity, institutional memory, long relationships, the slow wisdom of an institution that had been watching Rome's challenges unfold across decades. The early Senate was not a democratic body, and it is important to sit with that truth quietly, without flinching from it. Rome in the early republic was a society of stark and deeply entrenched inequality. The patricians, those families who traced their descent from the original senators, dominated political life with a thoroughness that left very little room for anyone else. They held the consulship. They controlled the major priesthoods, which in Rome were not merely religious offices but political ones of the highest importance. They interpreted the laws, conducted the state rituals, and managed the relationships with Rome's gods that were considered as essential to the city's survival as any military campaign. The plebeians, everyone else, which meant the vast majority of Roman citizens, were largely excluded from this world. They farmed the land. They served in the legions that were slowly extending Roman influence across the Italian peninsula. They paid the taxes and bore the burdens of an expanding state, and they were, in the formal structures of power, essentially voiceless. But here is where the story of the early Senate becomes something richer and more complicated than a simple tale of elite domination. The plebeians did not accept their exclusion quietly. Over the course of the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, Rome experienced a long, grinding, intermittently explosive series of conflicts between the patrician elite and the plebeian majority that historians call the conflict of the orators. It was not a revolution in any dramatic sense. There were no great battles, no burning of the Senate house. It was something slower and more Roman than that, a negotiation conducted through protest, through legal innovation, through the careful accumulation of precedents and concessions over many generations. The plebeians developed their own institutions, their own assembly, the concilium plebis, where they could meet and deliberate without patrician interference, their own elected officials, the tribunes of the plebs, who were granted a remarkable and unprecedented power, the power of the veto, intercessio. The tribune could stand before any act of the magistrate, any consul, any senator, any official of the Roman state, and simply say no, and that no had the force of the law, backed not by any formal military power, but by the sworn oath of every plebeian in Rome to treat any person who harmed a tribune as an enemy to be destroyed. It was, in its way, an extraordinary innovation. And the patrician Senate, faced with this organized, determined resistance, did what institutions under sustained pressure so often do. It adapted. Slowly and rarely, without resistance, the barriers began to fall. The Licinian Sextian laws of 367 before the Common Era opened the consulship to plebeians for the first time, a change that must have felt to those old patrician families like watching the very foundations of the world shift beneath their feet. The Lex Hortensia of 287 before the Common Era went further still, establishing that decisions made in the plebeian assembly would have the force of law binding on all Romans, patricians included, and with each of these concessions something interesting happened to the Senate. It changed. The rigid patrician exclusivity of the early Senate gave way to something more complex, a mixed aristocracy, where the old bloodline families gradually merged with a new class of wealthy, ambitious plebeian families who had accumulated enough influence, enough connections, enough auctoritas to claim their place among the governing elite. These families, the successful senatorial families of whatever origin, began to identify with each other more than with their respective ancient categories. A new aristocracy was coalescing, defined less by the accident of birth and more by the shared experience of power, wealth, public service, and the particular culture of ambition that the Senate both required and rewarded. The Romans had a word for this new class, too: the nobiles. The nobles, men whose ancestors had held the consulship, who could point to the images of their distinguished forebears mounted on the walls of the family atrium, each one a silent witness to the achievements that had elevated the family into the highest reaches of Roman public life. To belong to this class was to belong to a very particular world. It was a world of obligation as much as privilege, a world where the expectation was not merely that you would enjoy the fruits of your family's distinguished history, but that you would add to it, that you would serve and campaign and speak in the Senate and hold the magistracies, and demonstrate through your public life that the confidence Rome had placed in your family was not misplaced. The cursus honorum, the course of honors, was the formal structure through which a young Roman aristocrat was expected to move. Quaestor first, managing financial matters for the state, then aedile, responsible for the maintenance of the city's buildings and the organization of public games, then praetor, one of the senior magistrates who administered justice and commanded armies. And finally, if fortune and talent and the favor of his fellow citizens aligned, consul. Each office had its minimum age requirement. Each office was held for exactly 1 year. The system was designed deliberately to slow ambition, to force young men of talent to earn their advancement rather than simply inherit it, to ensure that by the time a man reached the heights of Roman public life, he had accumulated enough actual experience to be genuinely useful. It was, in its design, a beautiful system. And like all beautiful systems created by human beings, it was also, from its very first days, subject to every human flaw that its creators had hoped to design away: vanity and greed and the irresistible pull of self-interest dressed in the fine clothing of public virtue. But in those early centuries, in the long, slow morning of the Republic, there was something in the Senate that worked, something that allowed this collection of proud, competitive, brilliantly ambitious men to function as a coherent governing body, to coordinate Rome's defense, manage its finances, conduct its diplomacy, and guide its expansion across the Italian peninsula with a consistency and effectiveness that was, by any measure, remarkable. The secret, perhaps, was a shared belief in the institution itself. These men competed fiercely with one another. They argued, they maneuvered, they formed alliances and broke them. But beneath all of it ran a deep and genuine conviction that the Senate, the institution, the tradition, the accumulated weight of its history, was worth preserving, that the res publica was not merely a system of government, but something closer to a sacred trust, handed down from those original 100 fathers to each successive generation. That conviction would sustain the Senate through wars, through crises, through failures of leadership and moments of genuine catastrophe, and it would, in the end, prove both the Senate's greatest strength and the source of its most profound vulnerability. For there is a paradox buried at the heart of every institution built on shared belief. The more completely its members internalize the institution's values, the more fiercely they will fight, not just for the institution itself, but for their own interpretation of what that institution truly represents. And in a body of 300 men, each carrying the full weight of a distinguished family's expectations, each trained from boyhood to believe that his judgment was among the finest Rome had produced, 300 interpretations could splinter a room more thoroughly than any foreign army. But let us linger here in the middle centuries of the Republic, before the splintering begins, before the fault lines become chasms. Let us watch the Senate in the fullness of what it was, not yet what it would become, and not yet shadowed by what it would lose. The morning a session was called would begin well before the sun reached its height. A magistrate, consul, praetor, or tribune had the power to convene the Senate, and when he did, the announcement was made the previous day, so that senators might arrange their affairs and appear at the appointed hour. The meeting could be held in the Curia itself, or in any consecrated space within Rome's sacred boundary, the Palmarium, because the gods had to be present for any business of the Senate to carry divine sanction, and the gods in Rome were never merely metaphor. Before a single word of political business was spoken, the presiding magistrate would conduct the auspices, reading the will of the gods through the observation of birds, or the examination of sacrificial animals, or the careful interpretation of other signs that the Roman religious imagination had catalogued and systematized over centuries. If the auspices were unfavorable, the meeting would be postponed. The Senate's deliberations existed within a framework of divine relationship that Romans took with absolute seriousness, and to proceed without the gods' approval was not merely impious. It was genuinely dangerous, in a way that every man in the chamber would have felt viscerally. Once the auspices were taken and found acceptable, the real work could begin. The presiding magistrate would open with a relatio, a formal presentation of the matter at hand. He would lay out the question before the Senate with whatever detail and context he deemed necessary, and then he would call upon the senators to speak. And here the Senate's internal hierarchy asserted itself with quiet, absolute authority. Senators were not called upon at random, and they did not simply raise a hand and wait to be recognized. The order of speaking was determined by rank, and rank in the Senate was a precisely calibrated thing. The princeps senatus, the first man of the Senate, a title of enormous prestige usually given to the most distinguished living senator, was called upon first. After him, the former consuls, in order of their seniority, then the former praetors, the former aediles, the former quaestors, descending through the ranks of the cursus honorum until every man who wished to speak had been given his opportunity. To be called upon early was itself a form of recognition, a public acknowledgement of where one stood in the living architecture of Roman prestige, and the speeches themselves were an art form unto their own. Roman oratory was not the clipped, efficient communication of a modern meeting. It was a performance, a carefully constructed, deeply considered, rhetorically elaborate performance that drew on history, on philosophy, on legal precedent, on poetry, on the speaker's own family legacy, and on the accumulated cultural touchstones that every man in the room would have recognized and felt the weight of. A great senatorial speech could last for hours. Cicero, who would come somewhat later in our story, but whose example illuminates the entire tradition, once described the ideal orator as a man who could prove whatever he needed to prove, delight the audience regardless of the difficulty of his subject, and move the emotions of his listeners in whatever direction the argument required. These three tasks, docere, delectar, mover, to teach, to delight, to move, were the triple obligation of every man who rose to speak in the Senate chamber. And the senators who listened were not passive recipients of these performances. They murmured their approval or displeasure. They shifted on their benches in ways that communicated volumes to a speaker experienced enough to read the room. They called out brief interjections, words of encouragement or skepticism that shaped the atmosphere of the chamber in real time. A senator who felt the temperature of the room turning against him had to decide in the moment whether to press on or to modulate, to soften, to find a different angle of approach. It was governance as improvisation, conducted within a rigorous formal structure. When the speeches were concluded, the Senate did not, in most cases, proceed to a simple vote in the modern sense. The preferred method was the division, the dissessio, in which senators physically moved to one side of the chamber or the other to indicate their position. Those who supported the proposal gathered on one side, those who opposed it gathered on the other, and those who wished to record their opposition without committing fully to either position could choose a third path, sitting exactly where they were, which was interpreted as abstention. The result of this deliberation was called a senatus consultum, a decree of the Senate, and here, in the technical details, lies one of the most fascinating aspects of the Senate's power. Because technically a senatus consultum was not a law, it could not, strictly speaking, compel anyone to do anything. The Senate had no army of its own, no police force, no formal mechanism of enforcement standing behind its decisions. What it had was something more powerful than any of those things. It had the collective agreement of the men who controlled every army, every treasury, every magistracy, every priesthood in Rome. When the Senate spoke with a unified voice, it spoke with an authority so complete that resistance required not merely physical courage, but a willingness to stand against the entire weight of Roman civilization, its traditions, its gods, its most prestigious families, and the accumulated moral force of nearly 5 centuries of republican governance. Most men, most of the time, found that weight impossible to bear. The Senate's practical authority extended into almost every corner of Roman public life during the Middle Republic. Foreign policy was perhaps its most jealously guarded domain. Ambassadors from foreign powers who came to Rome came ultimately to address the Senate. Declarations of war, the formal, ritually precise declarations that Roman religious law required, were made with senatorial approval. Peace treaties were negotiated by generals in the field, but ratified or rejected in the curia. The relationships between Rome and the dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of communities that fell within Rome's expanding orbit were managed through a complex web of agreements, obligations, and status distinctions that only the Senate had the institutional memory to maintain. And then there were the provinces. As Rome expanded beyond the Italian peninsula, into Sicily, into Spain, into North Africa, into Greece, into Asia Minor, The question of how to govern these distant territories became one of the central preoccupations of the Senate's middle and late Republican era. Provinces were assigned to magistrates, usually proconsuls or propraetors, men whose original year of office had been extended to allow them to administer distant territories, and the Senate determined who received which province, for how long, and with what resources. This power of provincial assignment was, in practice, an extraordinary lever of political influence. A favorable province meant access to wealth, legitimate tax revenues, the not-so-legitimate enrichment that Romans regarded as one of the perquisites of office, and the military glory that came from campaigning against the province's various enemies. An unfavorable province meant years of hardship in some remote and unrewarding corner of the Mediterranean world, away from Rome, away from the Senate, away from the political relationships that were the lifeblood of any ambitious man's career. The Senate, deciding these assignments, held the futures of its own members in its collective hands. It was also responsible for the financial management of the Roman state, authorizing expenditures, determining the allocation of public funds between competing needs, managing the relationship between Rome's treasury and the extraordinary costs of maintaining an empire that was, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, expanding at a pace that sometimes seemed to outrun the administrative capacity to manage it. The 2nd century before the Common Era, this is a moment worth pausing in, because it represents something like the high noon of the Senate's authority. Rome had just emerged from the most terrifying conflict of its history, the wars against Carthage, and specifically against the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, who had crossed the Alps with his army and his famous elephants and spent 15 years marching through the Italian peninsula, winning battle after devastating battle, and yet somehow never quite breaking the Roman will to continue. The Senate's conduct during the Hannibalic War was, by any measure, remarkable. After Cannae, in 216 before the Common Era, where a Carthaginian army had surrounded and destroyed a Roman force of perhaps 70,000 men in a single afternoon, making it one of the most catastrophic military defeats in the ancient world. The Senate had gathered in a Rome that was very nearly paralyzed by grief and terror, and it had refused to ransom the Roman prisoners that Hannibal offered to return. It had refused to consider peace negotiations. It had levied new troops, raised new funds through measures that required asking Rome's wealthiest citizens to contribute far beyond what law or custom required, and it had sent those new armies back into the field with a strategy that was unglamorous but ultimately decisive. Avoid pitched battle, deny Hannibal's supplies, chip away at his alliances in Italy, and wait. The waiting took years, terrible, grinding, expensive years. But the Senate's collective discipline held, and in 202 before the Common Era, at the Battle of Zama in North Africa, the Carthaginian threat was finally ended. What emerged from that crucible was a Senate of extraordinary confidence, and confidence in political institutions, as in individuals, carries its own particular dangers. The Rome that had defeated Carthage was not the same Rome that had trembled before Hannibal. It was wealthier, more powerful, and possessed of an almost intoxicating sense of its own destiny. The Greek kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean were falling into Rome's orbit one by one, not always through direct conquest, but through the complex gravitational pull of a power so preponderant that smaller states found themselves gradually, inescapably, drawn into dependence. The Senate managed this expanding world with considerable skill. But the very success of Roman expansion was creating pressures within Roman society that the Senate's traditional tools were not designed to handle. Wealth was flooding into Rome from the conquered territories, enormous, disorienting quantities of it. Slaves, captured in the wars that never seemed to end, were being imported into Italy in numbers that were transforming the agricultural economy of the peninsula. Small farmers who had served in the legions for years and returned to find their land neglected or absorbed by wealthy neighbors were drifting into Rome and swelling the ranks of an urban population that was growing faster than any institution could comfortably manage. The gap between Rome's richest and Rome's poorest citizens, always significant, was becoming something qualitatively different, not merely inequality, but a social distance so vast that it strained the shared civic identity that the Republic had always depended upon. The Senate, composed entirely of men from the wealthiest stratum of Roman society, looked at these changes and saw different things. Some saw a crisis that demanded structural reform, a redistribution of public land, limits on the accumulation of the great estates called latifundia, measures to restore the class of small independent farmers who had always formed the backbone of the Roman legions and the Roman citizenry. Others saw in any such proposal an attack on the property, rights, and social arrangements that had sustained Roman prosperity, and they resisted with the full force of their considerable political and economic power. And others still, the most ambitious, the most perceptive, or perhaps simply the most reckless, looked at this widening tension between reform and resistance and saw in it something else entirely. They saw opportunity. For if the Senate was too divided, too compromised by the interests of its wealthiest members, to address the genuine grievances of Rome's swelling urban population and its dispossessed rural poor, then the man who could speak to those grievances directly, who could stand before the Roman people not as one senator among 300, but as a singular champion of the common cause, that man might find himself possessed of a political force that no institution, however venerable, could easily contain. The Senate had governed Rome for centuries through the careful management of collective authority, through the distribution of power among many hands, the checking of ambition by rival ambition, the slow and deliberate machinery of shared decision. But that machinery had been designed for a smaller, simpler world, and the world Rome now inhabited was neither small nor simple. The fault lines were deepening, quietly, beneath the marble floors of the Curia, beneath the worn stone of the Forum, beneath the very foundations of everything the Senate had built and believed and held sacred across the long centuries of the Republic's life, and in the generation that was coming, in the storms that were already gathering at the edges of the horizon. Everything that the Senate was, and everything it believed itself to be, would be put to a test that even its most prescient members could not fully anticipate. The name that would first test those foundations was not Caesar, not yet. It was a name quieter than Caesar, less theatrical, less surrounded by the particular mythology that the centuries would eventually construct around the men who followed him. The name was Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. And in 133 before the Common Era, this young man of impeccable aristocratic credentials stood before the Roman people and proposed something that the Senate had refused for generations to seriously consider. He proposed land reform. The details were, in one sense, modest. There was an old law, the Licinian Sextian law of 367 that had theoretically placed a limit on how much public land any single citizen could occupy. It had been ignored for so long that most Romans had forgotten it existed. Tiberius proposed simply to enforce it, to reclaim the excess land that wealthy families had accumulated beyond the legal limit, and to redistribute it among Rome's landless poor. It was, on its face, a conservative proposal, a restoration of an old law, not the invention of a new one, but what it represented was something the Senate's most powerful members understood immediately and instinctively, even if they could not always articulate it precisely. It was a challenge to the arrangements that had sustained their world, and it had been brought not through the Senate, where it could be managed and delayed and quietly smothered in the comfortable darkness of aristocratic consensus, but directly to the popular assembly. Tiberius had bypassed the Senate entirely. The Senate's response was swift and unambiguous. It found a tribune, a man named Marcus Octavius, a colleague of Tiberius within the tribunate itself, who was willing to exercise the veto, to stand before the assembly and say no on behalf of the senatorial establishment that had placed him there. And Tiberius did something that had no precedent in Roman history. He called upon the assembly to remove Octavius from his office, to strip a sitting tribune of the very position that was supposed to be sacrosanct, inviolable, protected by the ancient oath of every plebeian in Rome. The assembly complied. Octavius was removed. The land reform passed. But Tiberius had broken something, some invisible thread of shared assumption about how Roman political life was conducted, about the unwritten rules that held the whole elaborate structure together, even when the written rules were bent or ignored. He had shown that the popular assembly could be weaponized against the Senate's interests in ways that the Senate's traditional tools could not easily counter. The Senate's answer, in the end, was not legal. It was not procedural. It was a group of senators and their clients, armed with clubs and chair legs, who surrounded Tiberius Gracchus on the Capitoline Hill and beat him to death, along with approximately 300 of his supporters. It was the first political murder in the history of the Roman Republic, and Rome, that ancient city so attuned to precedent, to the accumulated weight of what had been done before, could not have missed the significance of what had just been established. Violence was now an available instrument of Roman political life. 12 years later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius took up the same cause with greater skill and broader ambition. He extended the reform program, proposed new grain laws, new road-building projects, new rights for Rome's Italian allies. He built a political coalition that was wider and more durable than his brothers, and he too was ultimately destroyed, not by clubs this time, but by the Senate's passage of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree, which declared a state of emergency and called upon the consuls to take whatever measures were necessary to preserve the state. Gaius Gracchus died on the Aventine Hill, either by his own hand or by the hand of a trusted slave, as the forces sent against him closed in. More than 3,000 of his supporters were killed in the aftermath. The Senate had won, in the narrow sense. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the weapons that had been drawn in these conflicts, the direct appeal to the popular assemblies, the use of emergency powers to justify political violence, the willingness to break precedent when the stakes felt high enough, none of these weapons could be put back in their sheaths. They would be picked up again and again and with each repetition they would become more familiar, more normalized, more simply part of the landscape of Roman political possibility. The generation that followed the Gracchi watched the consequences of these precedents accumulate with a kind of terrible momentum. The military reforms of Gaius Marius, the great general who reorganized the Roman army in the final decades of the 2nd century before the Common Era, introduced a new element into this already volatile mixture. Before Marius, Roman soldiers were required to meet a minimum property qualification. They had farms to return to, local roots, a stake in the stable order that the Republic represented. Marius opened the legions to the landless poor, the very men the Gracchi had tried and failed to restore to landed independence. These soldiers had nothing waiting for them at the end of their service, except the hope that their general would secure them land as a reward for their campaigns. Their loyalty was to him, to the man who had recruited them, led them, and would advocate for their interests when the wars were won, not to the Senate, not to the Republic, not to the abstract idea of the res publica that senators invoked in their speeches with such practiced reverence. To him, the Senate had, in its failure to address the land question, inadvertently created the conditions for its own most serious challenge. Armies that followed individuals rather than institutions, and the individuals were not slow to understand what this meant. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was the first to demonstrate the full implications. In 88, before the Common Era, when the Senate, maneuvering in its accustomed way, using legal mechanisms to reassign the command of a lucrative eastern campaign from Sulla to his rival Marius, Sulla did something that shattered every remaining assumption about the boundaries of Roman political behavior. He marched his army on Rome. No Roman general had ever done this. The ancient prohibition against bringing armed soldiers within the sacred pomerium was one of the oldest and most fundamental taboos in Roman religious and political life. It was the boundary that separated the military world from the civilian one, the world of violence from the world of law. Sulla crossed it without hesitation. He took the city, reversed the Senate's decision, and then left for his eastern campaign, leaving behind a Rome that had learned in a single afternoon that the ultimate argument in Roman politics was not rhetoric, not legal precedent, not senatorial auctoritas, but the loyalty of armed men. When Sulla returned from the east, victorious and immensely powerful, he crossed the pomerium again. This time he stayed. He had himself appointed dictator, an old republican office traditionally limited to 6 months and used only in genuine emergencies, and he used that office to remake the Roman constitution in ways that were explicitly designed to restore the Senate's authority and limit the power of the popular assemblies. He increased the Senate's membership to 600 men. He severely curtailed the powers of the tribunes. He placed new restrictions on the popular assemblies. He published proscription lists, lists of his political enemies whose lives were declared forfeit and whose property was confiscated, and he presided over a reign of terror that killed thousands of Romans, including many senators who had opposed him. And then, in 79, before the Common Era, he resigned. He simply retired, walked away from power with a completeness that astonished his contemporaries and has puzzled historians ever since, whether from genuine republican conviction, from illness, from a sense that his work was done, or from some private calculation that history has not preserved. Sulla gave up everything he had taken, and spent his last year in private life, dying in 78. The Senate he left behind was larger, formally more powerful, and profoundly, perhaps irreparably, diminished, because what Sulla had demonstrated even more completely than the Gracchi, even more starkly than Marius, was that the Senate's authority rested ultimately on the willingness of powerful men to respect it. And that willingness, it had now been established beyond any reasonable argument, was conditional. The decades between Sulla's retirement and the final crisis of the Republic were decades of extraordinary brilliance and extraordinary dysfunction in almost equal measure. This was the age of Cicero, the greatest orator Rome ever produced, a new man from the provincial town of Arpinum, who climbed the cursus honorum through the sheer force of his intelligence and the devastating beauty of his rhetoric, and who believed with every fiber of his considerable being that the Senate, reformed and renewed and led by men of genuine virtue, could still be what it had been in the best days of the Republic, the stabilizing center of Roman civilization. This was also the age of Pompey and Crassus and Caesar, three men of extraordinary ability and ambition who looked at the Senate Sulla had rebuilt and saw very clearly its structural weaknesses, who formed in 60 BC what historians would later call the First Triumvirate, not an official institution, not a legal arrangement of any kind, but a private compact of mutual interest between three of the most powerful men in Rome, designed to circumvent the Senate's ability to obstruct any one of them. The Senate watched this arrangement with alarm and could do relatively little about it. Cicero spoke against it, brilliantly and repeatedly. He invoked the old traditions, the ancestral customs, the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors that Romans had always cited as the ultimate standard of proper conduct. He argued for the Senate's central role in Roman governance with an eloquence that was genuinely moving and increasingly, heartbreakingly irrelevant, because the world Cicero was defending had already, in some essential sense, ceased to exist. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul through the 50s before the Common Era added an entirely new dimension to the crisis. 10 years of warfare against the Gallic tribes, conducted with a strategic brilliance that Rome recognized and admired even as some of its members feared it, produced a general of unparalleled prestige, commanding an army of tens of thousands of soldiers who were personally devoted to him, and who had been away from Italy long enough that the abstract loyalties of citizenship had been thoroughly supplanted by the concrete loyalty of shared hardship, shared victory, and the knowledge that their futures depended on their commander's ability to protect them. When the Senate in 49 before the Common Era ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, subject now to prosecution by his enemies for any legal irregularities from his years of command, Caesar's response was, by this point in Roman history, almost predictable. He crossed the Rubicon, that small river in northern Italy that marked the boundary of his provincial command, and the Republic, which had already been dying by degrees for decades, entered its final convulsion. The civil wars that followed, Caesar against Pompey, then Caesar's assassins against his heirs, then Antony against Octavian, consumed an entire generation of Roman political life and very nearly consumed Rome itself. The Senate during these years was a body caught between competing autocrats, forced to ratify decisions it had no power to prevent, stripped of the one thing that had always made it relevant, the assumption that it represented the legitimate center of Roman authority. It survived, technically. It continued to meet, to debate, to issue its decrees, but it was increasingly performing a role rather than exercising a function. And when the dust of the civil wars finally settled, when Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, stood alone as the unchallenged master of the Roman world and accepted in 27 before the Common Era the honorific title of Augustus, the Senate's new position became clear with a clarity that was almost elegant in its completeness. Augustus was, in his own carefully maintained self-presentation, not a king, not a dictator, not any of the categories that Roman political tradition associated with illegitimate personal rule. He was the princeps, the first citizen, the leading man of the Senate, governing through republican forms that he preserved with meticulous and almost theatrical attention. The Senate still met. The cursus honorum still functioned. The old magistracies were still filled each year by men who went through the traditional processes of election and held their traditional titles. But Augustus controlled the armies. Augustus controlled the treasury. Augustus determined through his enormous personal influence and the mechanisms of patronage and recommendation who received which province, which command, which office. The Senate advised, debated, ratified, and understood with varying degrees of acceptance and grief that the age in which its deliberations had actually shaped the fate of the world was passing into memory. There is something both melancholy and strangely peaceful in contemplating this transition, the slow settling of a vast institution into a new relationship with power, not destroyed, not entirely emptied of meaning, but transformed into something that required new ways of understanding what it was and what it was for, because the Senate did not simply vanish with the coming of the emperors. It endured and adapted and found new ways to matter, some of them genuine, some of them ceremonial, and all of them shadowed by the memory of what it had once been. And in that endurance, in that long and complicated survival, there is something that invites a kind of quiet contemplation, something that asks us to sit with the strangeness of institutions, how they are built on belief, and how they persist even when the belief has changed, sustained by habit and memory and the simple human reluctance to let go of the forms that once gave meaning to collective life. The Senate under the emperors was a study in the archaeology of meaning, like a great temple that has outlived the religion it was built to serve, still standing, still beautiful, still capable of inspiring awe in those who walked beneath its columns. The Senate of the imperial era retained all the outward forms of its republican grandeur, while housing, within those forms, a fundamentally altered relationship with power. Senators still wore their togas with the broad purple stripe, the latus clavus, that marked their rank. They still processed into the curia with the measured dignity that centuries of tradition required. They still rose to speak in the prescribed order, still listened to the relatio of the presiding magistrate, still moved to one side of the chamber or the other when the time came to record their position. But the emperor's position was always known before the debate began, not because he always attended. Many emperors were notably absent from senatorial proceedings, governing from palaces or distant campaigns, but because his preferences were communicated through intermediaries, through the weight of his known opinions, through the simple, omnipresent awareness that the most powerful man in the world was watching, and that his approval was the only approval that ultimately mattered. There were emperors who treated the Senate with genuine respect, who consulted it sincerely, who accepted criticism from its most distinguished members, with something approaching grace, who understood that the fiction of shared governance was worth maintaining not merely for appearances, but because it served real functions of legitimacy and administrative efficiency. Augustus himself was a master of this, spending 50 years cultivating the impression that he was governing with the Senate rather than above it, attending debates, deferring publicly to senatorial opinion on matters where his own preferences were not engaged, accepting the ancient forms with a humility that was almost certainly calculated but no less effective for that. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 of the Common Era, was remembered by the Senate with particular warmth. The historian Pliny the Younger, who served in the Senate during Trajan's reign, wrote letters and a formal speech of thanksgiving, the Panegyricus, that described a relationship between emperor and Senate that seemed, at least in Pliny's carefully constructed account, to approach something like the old republican ideal of shared deliberation. Senators could speak freely. Trajan listened. Dissent within certain limits was tolerated and even welcomed as a sign of the emperor's confidence in his own judgment. These were the good years, and they were real, not merely propaganda. But the Senate had also learned, through hard and sometimes fatal experience, to navigate the years that were not good. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, a man of genuine intelligence and considerable administrative ability, who was also profoundly suspicious, increasingly reclusive, and capable of a cold brutality that his contemporaries found deeply unsettling, transformed the relationship between Senate and Emperor into something that carried a new and terrible dimension: the treason trials. Under Tiberius, an old law, the lex majestatis, originally designed to prosecute those who had damaged the majesty of the Roman people through incompetence or treachery in military command, was extended and expanded until it became an instrument of political terror. Informers, known as delatores, could bring accusations against senators, equestrians, even members of the imperial family itself, and were rewarded with a portion of the convicted person's confiscated property. The Senate chamber, which had once been the arena of Rome's greatest rhetorical performances, became a place of careful silence, of measured words, of speeches that said precisely what was safe and nothing more. The philosopher Tacitus, writing about this era with the cold, brilliant fury of a man who had lived through his own version of these pressures under the Emperor Domitian, described the psychology of the Tiberian Senate with devastating precision. Men who had been trained to speak were learning, instead, the arts of strategic silence and calculated ambiguity, the very skills that the cursus honorum had been designed to cultivate: bold argument, honest assessment, the courage to tell powerful men what they needed to hear rather than what they wanted to, were becoming, under certain emperors, survival liabilities rather than civic virtues. And yet, even in these dark passages, the Senate endured, even under Caligula, whose brief and chaotic reign seemed designed to demonstrate every possible way in which absolute power could be exercised with maximum contempt for every Roman institution, even under Nero, whose later years became a theater of paranoia and excess that consumed some of the finest minds and most distinguished families of the age. The Senate continued to meet, to process, to perform the ancient rituals of republican governance in the great chamber where the ghosts of Cicero and Cato still seemed to drift between the benches. There is something almost moving in this persistence, not the persistence of power, The Senate had lost that gradually and then suddenly in the convulsions of the late Republic, but the persistence of form, of identity, of a collective self-understanding that refused to entirely dissolve even when the substance that had once animated it was gone. The senators of the imperial era were not, by and large, weak or foolish men. They were educated, experienced, often genuinely talented administrators who managed the vast complexity of an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, with considerable skill. The provinces they governed, the armies they sometimes commanded, the legal cases they adjudicated, the diplomatic relationships they maintained, all of this was real work, consequential work, work that shaped the lives of millions of people across the breadth of the ancient world. They simply did it within a framework they hadn't chosen and could not fundamentally alter. And perhaps that is not so different from what most human beings have always done. The Senate's story, in its long imperial twilight, becomes in some ways more intimate and more recognizable than the grand drama of the Republic. It becomes the story of individuals navigating systems larger than themselves, finding meaning and purpose and even dignity within constraints they had not designed, serving institutions whose grandest days lay in the past, carrying on because carrying on was what the work required. As the empire aged through the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, through the golden stability of the Antonine dynasty, through the turbulent 3rd century with its parade of soldier emperors who rose and fell with bewildering speed, through the gradual administrative splitting of the empire into eastern and western halves, the Senate's role continued to evolve. It became increasingly a body of administrators and local aristocrats rather than a governing council in any meaningful sense. Its membership expanded and diversified, drawing in elites from across the Roman world, from Spain and North Africa, from Greece and the eastern provinces, from Gaul and even Britain, until it was genuinely, in some sense, the representative body of a Mediterranean civilization rather than the council of a single city. This was something new, something that even the most visionary of the old Republican senators could not have imagined when they sat on those worn benches in the Curia and debated the allocation of Sicilian grain supplies. The Senate had outlasted its own original purpose and become something else, a symbol, a legitimizing institution, a thread of continuity connecting the empire's present to its republican past. And in doing so, it had achieved a kind of immortality that pure power never could have granted it. Power, in Rome as everywhere, was always temporary, always contingent on the loyalty of armies, the favor of fortune, the biological accident of succession, but the idea of the Senate, the idea that governance should involve deliberation, that power should be accountable to some assembly of peers, that the voices of the distinguished and experienced deserved to be heard before decisions were made, that idea proved far more durable than any particular emperor's reign. It echoed forward through time in ways that would have astonished and perhaps overwhelmed those early senators who gathered with Romulus, if Romulus ever truly existed, on a hill above the Tiber and simply tried to figure out how to govern a small, vulnerable, endlessly ambitious community of human beings. The Senate's last formal act in Rome, whatever it was, lost now in the fragmentary records of the late 5th century, was not dramatic. There was no final great debate, no Ciceronian peroration to mark the occasion. The institution simply ceased as most things do, not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet trailing away into silence, like a voice that has been speaking for a very long time, finally finding its rest. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said within those walls across the centuries, full of the arguments and the alliances, the betrayals, and the moments of genuine courage, the long afternoons of tedious bureaucratic business, and the extraordinary hours when the fate of millions hung on the words being chosen by a single man standing in the lamplight at the center of the chamber. Now the lamp oil burns low in the imagination, and the marble cools, and the voices that once filled this space with such urgency and passion dissolve back into the quiet they came from. There is a kind of peace in this, in the contemplation of something so vast and so human, so brilliant and so flawed, so enduring and yet ultimately so mortal. The Senate of Rome lasted in one form or another for more than 1,000 years, from those first tentative gatherings of elders on the hills above the Tiber to the slow dissolution of the Western Empire's institutions in the 5th century, and in the Eastern Empire, in Constantinople, something that called itself the Senate continued for centuries beyond even that. 1,000 years of deliberation, 1,000 years of voices rising and falling in that particular rhythm that human beings fall into when they are trying, however imperfectly, to figure out together how to live. The forum is quiet now in the mind's eye. The columns stand in the long gold light of a late afternoon that exists only in imagination, belonging to no particular century and therefore to all of them. A crow crosses the open sky above the ruins, and the city that was once the center of everything breathes slowly in and out, carrying its memories the way old stone carries warmth, long after the sun has moved on, long after the light has changed. Somewhere in the deepening quiet, a leaf turns over in a courtyard that no longer exists, and the sound it makes is the sound of a page turning, a voice pausing between thoughts, a deliberation that has been going on for so long that it has become indistinguishable from the silence surrounding it. The Senate remains, not as marble, not as institution, but as an idea drifting forward through time, patient and unhurried, carrying within it the accumulated weight of every question that was ever asked within those ancient walls about how power should be held and who should hold it, and what we owe to one another when we gather in the same room and try to build something together that will outlast us all. The light fades from gold to amber, from amber to the soft, indefinite color of approaching dusk, and the city rests, and the centuries settle gently over everything like dust over marble, and the voices grow quieter and quieter until they are barely distinguishable from the sound of breathing, from the sound of the mind, finally still, drifting in the warm dark toward whatever comes next after a long day of thinking and remembering and wondering. Somewhere, always, a Senate is in session. And somewhere, always, the debate continues. The world is made of things we cannot see, and yet they shape everything. In the depths of matter, beneath the surface of atoms, below the familiar realm of molecules and cells, there exists a place where the very fabric of reality becomes something else entirely, something strange and beautiful, a realm so small that light itself becomes a clumsy tool for observation, a domain where particles dance in patterns that defy the everyday logic we carry through our waking hours. Tonight, we descend into that hidden architecture, the quantum world where the fundamental pieces of existence reveal themselves, not as solid objects, but as fleeting probabilities, as whispers of energy, as moments of interaction that build the universe from the ground up. This is the realm of particle physics, a landscape populated by entities with curious names, quarks and leptons, bosons and fermions, each one a thread in the tapestry of everything, each one governed by forces that operate beyond our direct perception. And yet, these invisible actors perform on a stage that determines the color of stars, the weight of atoms, the very possibility of matter itself. Imagine standing at the edge of understanding, where human curiosity meets the limits of the very small, where questions about the nature of reality require instruments larger than cathedrals, where the search for answers has consumed generations of minds, each one adding a piece to an ever-expanding puzzle. The story of particle physics is not simply a catalog of discoveries. It is a journey into increasingly subtle layers of existence, a gradual unveiling that began when ancient philosophers first wondered whether matter could be divided infinitely, or whether there existed some final, irreducible grain of substance, some fundamental unit beyond which nothing smaller could be found. For centuries, that question remained purely philosophical, a thought experiment conducted in the mind, without instruments, without mathematics precise enough to capture such minute scales. But as human understanding deepened, as tools became more refined, the question transformed from abstract speculation into something that could be tested, measured, answered through careful observation and brilliant reasoning. The particles we now know, the building blocks that construct protons and neutrons, the force carriers that mediate interactions, the elusive neutrinos that pass through entire planets without notice, these were once beyond imagination, unthinkable, and yet, through patience and ingenuity, they emerge from a shadow into the light of knowledge. There is something profoundly calming about contemplating these depths, about recognizing that beneath the complexity of daily experience, beneath the intricate machinery of biology and chemistry, there lies a simpler, more elegant set of rules, a handful of particles, a few fundamental forces, all interacting according to principles that can be written in equations, understood through symmetry, predicted with extraordinary precision. In this hidden world, time behaves strangely. Particles appear and vanish in fractions of a second, so brief that ordinary language struggles to contain them. Interactions occur across distances measured in femtometers, a scale so small that a million of them would barely span the width of a single human hair. And yet, within these infinitesimal domains, the character of everything is determined. The narrative we are about to explore unfolds slowly across decades and continents, through the work of thousands of researchers, each one contributing observations, theories, refinements to an ever-growing understanding. It is a story without a single hero, but rather a collective human endeavor, a conversation across time, where each generation builds upon the insights of those who came before. We will wander through this landscape gently, examining the particles themselves, the forces that bind them, the symmetries that govern their behavior, the experimental apparatus designed to reveal them, and the theoretical frameworks that predict their properties with astonishing accuracy. We will trace the emergence of this knowledge, not as a triumphant march, but as a patient accumulation of understanding, moment by moment, discovery by discovery, and as we move deeper, we will find that particle physics is not merely a technical discipline, but a meditation on existence itself, a way of asking what it means for something to be real, to be fundamental, to be necessary rather than contingent. These questions echo in the quiet spaces between particles, in the symmetries that seem almost too perfect to be accidental, in the mathematical beauty that emerges when nature is observed at its most basic level. So we begin at the threshold, where the visible world gives way to the invisible, where matter dissolves into energy and energy crystallizes into matter, where the dance of particles creates everything we know and everything we have yet to discover. The journey begins, as so many great journeys do, with the simple act of questioning what seems obvious. For most of human history, matter appeared solid, dependable, continuous. A stone was a stone. Water was water. And the idea that these substances might be composed of smaller, invisible units seemed either obvious or absurd, depending on the century and the culture asking the question. The ancient Greeks debated this puzzle with remarkable sophistication. Around 400 years before the Common Era, a philosopher named Democritus proposed that all matter consisted of tiny, indivisible particles he called atoms, from the Greek word atomos, meaning uncuttable. He imagined these atoms as eternal, indestructible, differing only in shape and size, tumbling through empty space, combining and separating to create the rich variety of substances we observe. It was a beautiful idea, born entirely from reasoning rather than experiment, and for nearly 2,000 years it remained just that, an elegant Dachan thought with no way to test its validity. Other philosophers disagreed, Aristotle among them, arguing that matter was infinitely divisible, that the notion of empty space made no sense, that the world consisted of continuous substances governed by qualities rather than discrete particles. His view dominated Western thought for centuries, not because it was proven, but because it aligned with the intuitions of experience, and because Aristotle's influence was so profound that questioning him seemed almost heretical. But ideas have a way of returning, especially when they resonate with something true about the nature of things. By the 17th century, as experimental methods began to replace pure philosophy, the atomic hypothesis started to acquire new life. Chemists noticed patterns in how substances combined. They observed that elements seemed to join in definite proportions, not in arbitrary amounts, as if some underlying discreteness governed their interactions. John Dalton, working in the early 1800s, revived the atomic theory with empirical support. He proposed that each element consisted of identical atoms, unique to that element, and that chemical reactions were simply rearrangements of these atoms into new configurations. His theory explained the observed ratios in chemical combinations, and though his atoms were still hypothetical, invisible to any instrument of the time, the explanatory power of the idea began to win converts. Still, many remained skeptical. The atom was, at this stage, more of a useful fiction than an established reality, a convenient accounting device that helped chemists keep track of reactions. but not necessarily a description of actual physical entities. The 19th century brought deeper mysteries. Physicists studying electricity discovered that it seemed to flow in discrete units. Michael Faraday's experiments with electrolysis revealed that charge itself appeared quantized, coming in fundamental portions rather than as a continuous fluid. This was peculiar, suggestive, a hint that perhaps the ancient intuition about discreteness in nature had merit after all. Then came the discovery that would crack open the atom itself, revealing it not as the final indivisible unit Democritus had imagined, but as a complex structure, a miniature cosmos with its own architecture. In 1897, J.D.J. Thomson, working at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, performed experiments with cathode rays, mysterious emanations that appeared when electrical current passed through evacuated glass tubes. By subjecting these rays to magnetic and electric fields, Thomson demonstrated that they consisted of particles, each carrying a negative charge, and each possessing a mass far smaller than even the lightest atom. He had discovered the electron, the first subatomic particle, the first proof that atoms were not indivisible after all, but contained smaller constituents. This was a threshold moment, a crossing from one understanding of matter to another. If atoms contained electrons, then atoms had internal structure, and the question immediately arose, what else might they contain, and how were these pieces arranged? Thomson himself proposed a model, sometimes called the plum pudding model, in which electrons were embedded in a diffuse sphere of positive charge, like raisins in a pudding. The positive and negative charges balanced, creating a neutral atom overall, but the internal dynamics remained mysterious. The true structure emerged through one of the most famous experiments in physics history, conducted by Ernest Rutherford and his colleagues Hans Geiger and Ernest Marsden between 1909 and 1911. They took a thin sheet of gold foil, only a few atoms thick, and bombarded it with alpha particles, helium nuclei ejected from radioactive material. If Thomson's model were correct, these massive, fast-moving alpha particles should pass through the gold atoms with only slight deflections, like bullets through fog. Most of the alpha particles did exactly that, but a small fraction, perhaps 1 in 8,000, bounced back at large angles, some nearly reversing direction entirely. Rutherford later said that this was the most incredible event of his life, as astonishing as if a shell fired at tissue paper had rebounded and struck the gunner. The only explanation, Rutherford realized, was that the atom's positive charge and most of its mass were concentrated in an incredibly tiny, dense nucleus at the center, with electrons orbiting at relatively vast distances. Most of the atom, it turned out, was empty space, and when an alpha particle happened to strike a nucleus head-on, the electromagnetic repulsion sent it careening backward. This nuclear model of the atom, published in 1911, transformed physics. Suddenly, the atom resembled a miniature solar system, with a massive central nucleus and lightweight electrons in orbit, but this picture immediately presented problems. According to classical electromagnetic theory, an orbiting electron should constantly radiate energy, spiraling inward and collapsing into the nucleus in a fraction of a second. Atoms should be unstable, yet they persisted, endured for billions of years, radiated light only under specific circumstances, and when they did, emitted only certain specific wavelengths, not a continuous spectrum, something was profoundly wrong with the classical picture, or profoundly incomplete. The resolution came from an unlikely direction, from the radical idea that energy itself might be quantized. This concept had emerged in 1900 when Max Planck, studying the spectrum of radiation emitted by hot objects, found that he could explain the observations only by assuming that energy was absorbed and emitted in discrete packets, quanta, rather than continuously. Planck himself was uncomfortable with this conclusion, viewing it as a mathematical trick rather than a Doktuker description of reality, but the idea proved remarkably fertile. In 1913, Niels Bohr applied quantum thinking to the atom. He proposed that electrons could occupy only certain allowed orbits, each with a specific energy, and that electrons could jump between these orbits by absorbing or emitting precise amounts of energy corresponding to photons of specific wavelengths. This explained the discrete spectral lines observed in atomic emissions. It stabilized the atom by declaring that electrons in allowed orbits simply did not radiate, a postulate that defied classical physics but matched observation. Bohr's model was a hybrid, mixing classical orbits with quantum rules in a way that was logically inconsistent, and yet it worked. It predicted the hydrogen spectrum with stunning accuracy, and it suggested that the quantum world operated according to principles fundamentally different from the everyday physics of motion and force. The atom, once thought indivisible, now revealed itself as a structured entity containing a nucleus and electrons, governed by quantum rules that permitted only certain states. But the nucleus itself remained a mystery. What was it made of? How did it hold together? What determined which elements were stable and which decayed? Rutherford suspected that the nucleus contained positive particles, which he called protons, roughly 1,800 times heavier than electrons. The number of protons determined the element, hydrogen with 1, helium with 2, and so on up the periodic table, but the masses didn't add up. A helium nucleus, for instance, had 2 protons, but a mass roughly 4 times that of hydrogen, suggesting the presence of something else. Some additional neutral particles seemed necessary to account for the mass. This missing piece, the neutron, remained elusive for years, undetected because its lack of charge made it invisible to the methods that had revealed electrons and protons. It was not until 1932 that James Chadwick, also working at the Cavendish, definitively identified the neutron through careful experiments with beryllium radiation. Now the atomic nucleus had a clearer picture. Protons and neutrons, collectively called nucleons, bound together in an incredibly tight cluster with electrons occupying quantum states around this core. But binding nucleons together presented yet another puzzle. Protons carry positive charge, and like charges repel, the electromagnetic force should blow the nucleus apart, yet nuclei remain stable, often for billions of years. There had to be another force, something stronger than electromagnetism at very short distances, something that could overcome the electrical repulsion and hold nucleons together. This force, eventually called the strong nuclear force, operated only across distances comparable to the size of the nucleus itself, roughly a femtometer, but within that range, it was the most powerful force in nature. By the early 1930s, physics had descended beneath the atom, revealed the nucleus, identified three fundamental particles, the electron, the proton, and the neutron, and recognized that at least two fundamental forces governed their behavior, electromagnetism and the strong force, the picture seemed almost complete. Matter built from three types of particles, governed by understandable forces, but nature, as it turned out, was far stranger and far richer than anyone yet imagined. The first hint that the picture was incomplete came from the sky itself, from cosmic rays, high-energy particles that constantly rained down upon the Earth from space, streaming in from distant stellar explosions, from the sun, from sources still not entirely understood. In the 1930s, physicists began sending detectors aloft, carried by balloons into the upper atmosphere, and buried deep underground to study these mysterious visitors. What they found was bewildering. Cosmic rays, when they struck the atmosphere, created showers of secondary particles, and among these particles were things that didn't fit the known categories. In 1936, Carl Anderson, studying cosmic ray tracks in a cloud chamber, observed a particle that curved in a magnetic field exactly like an electron, but in the opposite direction. It had the same mass as an electron, but carried a positive charge instead of negative. This was the positron, the first antimatter particle ever detected, predicted just a few years earlier by Paul Dirac through purely theoretical reasoning. Dirac had been working on an equation to describe electrons in a way consistent with both quantum mechanics and special relativity, and his equation, beautiful and precise, produced two sets of solutions, one for particles with negative energy, which seemed nonsensical. Rather than dismiss these solutions as mathematical artifacts, Dirac proposed that they represented actual particles, mirror images of electrons with opposite charge. He called them anti-electrons. Though the name positron soon took hold, the discovery confirmed a profound principle that for every particle there might exist an antiparticle, identical in mass but opposite in charge and certain other properties. When particle and antiparticle met, they could annihilate, converting their entire mass into energy in accordance with Einstein's equation. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. This opened a strange new chapter. The universe now contained not just matter, but antimatter. And the question arose, why does our world seem built almost entirely from matter, with antimatter appearing only fleetingly in high-energy events, vanishing almost as soon as it forms? That question remains incompletely answered even now, but in the 1930s, it was merely one puzzle among many. More peculiar particles emerged from cosmic ray studies. In 1937, Anderson and Seth Neddermeyer found evidence of another particle, heavier than an electron but lighter than a proton. They called it a mesotron, later shortened to meson, and specifically, this was the muon. The muon was deeply confusing, and it seemed to be a heavier version of the electron, identical in every way except mass, unstable, decaying in about 2/millionths of a second into an electron and two neutrinos. It participated in electromagnetic interactions, but not in the strong nuclear force. The physicist I. Rabi supposedly quipped, "Who ordered that?" expressing the bewilderment of the community. The muon served no obvious purpose in building atoms, had no clear role in nuclear structure, and yet there it was, a redundant copy of the electron existing for reasons no one could immediately fathom. Nature, it seemed, was not as economical as physicists had hoped. Meanwhile, theorists were grappling with how forces actually worked at the quantum level. Electromagnetism had been successfully described by quantum electrodynamics. QED, a theory developed through the 1930s and 40s by Feynman, Schwinger, Tominaga, and others. In QED, forces arose from the exchange of particles, specifically photons, the quanta of light. When two electrons repelled each other, they did so by exchanging virtual photons, particles that existed only briefly, borrowing energy from the uncertainty principle, mediating the electromagnetic interaction before vanishing. This was a radically different picture from classical physics, where forces were fields that permeated space. Now forces themselves were quantized, carried by particles, transmitted through discrete exchanges. The strong nuclear force, logically, should work similarly, and in 1935, Hideki Yukawa proposed that nucleons were bound together by exchanging particles he called mesons, analogous to how photons mediated electromagnetism. But Yukawa's meson had to be massive to account for the short range of the strong force, roughly 100 to 200 times the electron's mass. When Anderson's muon was discovered, many initially thought it was Yukawa's particle, but the muon interacted too weakly. It passed through matter almost unimpeded, not behaving at all like the strong force carrier that theory predicted. The true Yukawa particle, the pion, was finally discovered in 1947 by Cecil Powell and his team, using photographic emulsions exposed to cosmic rays at high altitude. The pion came in three varieties: positively charged, negatively charged, and neutral, and it interacted strongly with nucleons, mediating the force that held nuclei together. Now the particle landscape was becoming crowded. Electrons, protons, neutrons, positrons, muons, pions, neutrinos. Each new discovery raised new questions. Were there patterns, families, underlying principles that governed which particles could exist? The situation grew more complicated throughout the 1950s. Physicists built increasingly powerful particle accelerators, machines that could smash protons and other particles together at high energies, creating conditions similar to those in the early universe, allowing new particles to materialize from pure energy. And particles appeared in abundance, strange new particles that decayed in unfamiliar ways, particles that seemed to violate expected symmetries, particles that appeared only in pairs, particles with lifetimes ranging from stable to almost instantaneous. The kaon, discovered in 1947, exhibited particularly odd behavior. It was produced copiously in high-energy collisions, suggesting it formed through the strong force. Yet it decayed slowly, as if governed by a much weaker interaction. This strange behavior led physicists to introduce a new quantum number called strangeness to classify these particles and predict their interactions. Then came the baryons, heavy particles, including the proton and neutron, but also many others: the lambda, the sigma, the psi, the omega, each with distinct masses and quantum properties, each fitting into families that suggested underlying patterns without revealing the pattern's origin. And the mesons multiplied. Beyond the pion, there were kaons, eta mesons, rho mesons, dozens of variants, all unstable, all decaying through various channels into lighter particles. By the early 1960s, hundreds of particles had been discovered, and the field faced a crisis of complexity. This couldn't be the fundamental level. It seemed inconceivable that nature required hundreds of elementary particles, each with arbitrary properties. There had to be a deeper layer, a more economical description. The breakthrough came from seeking patterns in the chaos. Murray Gell-Mann and Yuval Ne'eman independently proposed a classification scheme in 1961, organizing particles according to their quantum numbers, arranging them in geometric patterns they called the Eightfold Way, after the Buddhist path to enlightenment. These patterns had gaps, empty spaces where particles should exist if the symmetry was real, and in 1964, one of these predictions was spectacularly confirmed. The omega minus baryon, predicted by the pattern but never observed, was found in bubble chamber photographs at Brookhaven National Laboratory, with exactly the properties Gell-Mann had specified. This suggested that the symmetries were real, that particles were not arbitrary, but fell into families governed by deeper principles. But what created these patterns? What underlying structure could explain the Eightfold Way? Gell-Mann proposed an answer in 1964, one that seemed almost absurd at first. He suggested that protons, neutrons, and all other baryons and mesons were not fundamental at all, but were composed of even smaller entities he whimsically named quarks, borrowing a word from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. According to this scheme, there were three types of quarks, which he called up, down, and strange, each carrying a fractional electric charge, something never before observed. The up quark carried a charge of positive 2/3. The down and strange quarks each carried negative 1/3. A proton consisted of 2 up quarks and 1 down quark, giving a total charge of positive 1. A neutron contained 1 up and 2 down quarks, giving 0 charge. Mesons were quark-antiquark pairs, while baryons were combinations of 3 quarks. This model explained the Eightfold Way perfectly, predicted particle masses and quantum numbers, and reduced the hundreds of observed particles to combinations of just 3 fundamental constituents. But there was a problem. Nobody had ever seen a free quark, ever. Despite intensive searches, quarks appeared only in bound states, never in isolation. This seemed bizarre. If protons were made of the quarks, why couldn't you knock a quark loose? The answer, it turned out, lay in the peculiar nature of the strong force itself. Unlike electromagnetism, which weakens with distance, the strong force grew stronger as quarks were pulled apart, like a rubber band that becomes harder to stretch. Try to separate quarks, and the energy invested eventually becomes sufficient to create new quark-antiquark pairs, which bind with the original quarks, forming new composite particles, rather than freeing individual quarks. This property, called confinement, meant that quarks were permanently imprisoned within larger particles, observable only through their collective behavior, their combined quantum numbers and masses. Throughout the late 1960s and early 70s, the quark model gained acceptance, but it required modification. Deep inelastic scattering experiments, where electrons were fired at protons at very high energies, revealed that protons contained point-like constituents, confirming the quark hypothesis, but also showing that quarks themselves carried only about half the proton's momentum, suggesting something else was present. That something else turned out to be gluons. the carriers of the strong force itself, just as photons mediated electromagnetism. Gluons mediated the strong interaction between quarks, binding them into protons, neutrons, and mesons. But gluons had a unique property. Unlike photons, which carried no electric charge and thus didn't interact with each other, gluons carried a type of charge related to the strong force, a property called color charge, and gluons could interact with other gluons, creating a self-reinforcing field that grew stronger with distance, explaining confinement. The theory describing quarks and gluons, called quantum chromodynamics, or QCD, became the accepted description of the strong force, paralleling quantum electrodynamics but with crucial differences arising from gluon self-interaction. Meanwhile, the weak force, responsible for certain types of radioactive decay, was being unified with electromagnetism through the work of Glasgow, Weinberg, and Salam. They showed that at high energies, electromagnetism and the weak force were aspects of a single electroweak interaction, mediated by four particles, the photon and three massive bosons called the W+, W-, and Z0. These massive force carriers were predicted in the 1960s but not observed until 1983, when CERN's particle accelerator finally achieved sufficient energy to create them, confirming the electroweak theory and earning its architects the Nobel Prize. The structure was becoming clearer, but gaps remained, tantalizing hints that the picture was still incomplete. By the mid-1970s, physicists had organized their knowledge into what became known as the Standard Model, a comprehensive framework describing all known particles and three of the four fundamental forces. It was an extraordinary achievement, unifying decades of experimental discovery with elegant mathematical principles. The matter particles, the fermions, fell into two categories: quarks, which participated in the strong force and came in 6 types or flavors: up, down, strange, charm, bottom, and top, and leptons, which did not feel the strong force, including the electron, a muon, tau, and their associated neutrinos. These 12 particles, 6 quarks and 6 leptons, arranged themselves into 3 generations, 3 families with identical properties except for mass. The first generation contained the up and down quarks, the electron, and the electron neutrino, the building blocks of ordinary matter. The second generation, heavier and unstable, included the charm and strange quarks, the muon and the muon neutrino. The third, heavier still, contained top and bottom quarks, the tau and the tau neutrino. Why 3 generations? Why not 1 or 5? Nobody knew. The pattern suggested deeper structure, but the reason remained hidden. The force carriers, the bosons, included the photon for electromagnetism, 8 gluons for the strong force, and the W and Z bosons for the weak force. Each mediated interactions between matter particles according to specific rules, coupling strengths and symmetries. But even as this framework solidified, questions persisted. The most glaring concerned the origin of mass itself. In the Standard Model's equations, particles should be massless, giving them mass by hand. Simply inserting mass values into the equations destroyed the mathematical consistency, violated the symmetries that made the theory work. Yet, obviously, particles had mass, electrons, quarks, the W and Z bosons, all possessed definite masses measured to extraordinary precision. The resolution, proposed in 1964 by several physicists, including Peter Higgs, Francois Englert, and Robert Brute, involved a radical idea that empty space itself was not truly empty, but filled with an invisible field, the Higgs field, permeating all of reality. Particles acquired mass by interacting with this field. The stronger the interaction, the more mass the particle possessed. Photons, which didn't interact with the Higgs field at all, remained massless, while the top quark, with the strongest coupling, became the heaviest fundamental particle known. This was more than a mathematical trick. If the Higgs field existed, then quantum theory predicted it should have an associated particle, the Higgs boson, a quantum of excitation in the field itself. Finding this particle became one of the great quests of experimental physics, but it would require enormous energies to create, far beyond what any 1960s accelerator could achieve. The Higgs boson, if it existed, was heavy, and creating heavy particles required enormous collision energies. Thanks again to mass energy equivalence, decades passed. Accelerators grew larger, more powerful, more precise. The Large Electron-Positron Collider at CERN, operational from 1989 to 2000, searched without success, ruling out lighter masses but unable to reach high enough energies to probe where the Higgs was most likely to hide. Meanwhile, other pieces of the Standard Model were falling into place with stunning confirmations. The top quark, predicted by the pattern of generations but stubbornly absent from experiments, was finally discovered in 1995 at Fermilab's Tevatron Collider. It was extraordinarily heavy, about 185 times the mass of a proton, so heavy it decayed almost instantaneously, never forming bound states, existing only as a fleeting signature in detector data. The tau neutrino, the last of the Standard Model leptons to be directly observed, was confirmed in 2000, again at Fermilab, completing the roster of matter particles, but the Higgs remained elusive, its discovery waiting for a machine powerful enough, precise enough, capable of sifting through trillions of collisions to find the rare events where a Higgs boson briefly materialized before decaying into other particles. That machine, the Large Hadron Collider, began operations in 2008, built in a circular tunnel 27 kilometers in circumference, buried up to 175 meters beneath the Swiss-French border. It accelerated protons to 99.99999% the speed of light, smashing them together with energy 7 times greater than any previous collider. The scale was staggering. Superconducting magnets cooled to near absolute zero, detector systems weighing thousands of tons, millions of sensing elements recording particle trajectories, energies, identities, collaborations involving thousands of physicists from dozens of countries, analyzing petabytes of data, searching for subtle signatures against overwhelming backgrounds. And on July 4th, 2012, CERN announced the discovery, a new particle, consistent with the Higgs boson, observed independently by 2 different detector collaborations, ATLAS and CMS. Each had collected sufficient data to claim discovery, seeing an excess of events at a mass around 125 billion electron volts, exactly where a Higgs boson would produce such a signal. Further analysis confirmed the particle's properties, its spin, its decay modes, its couplings to other particles, Everything matched predictions. The Higgs field was real, the mechanism for mass generation confirmed, and the Standard Model was complete, at least in its particle content. This was a triumph, a validation of theoretical physics' power to predict phenomena decades before experimental confirmation. But it was also, in a sense, a disappointment. The Standard Model, for all its success, was clearly incomplete. It said nothing about gravity, the fourth fundamental force, which remained described only by general relativity, incompatible with quantum mechanics at fundamental levels. Attempts to create a quantum theory of gravity had produced mathematical infinities, problems with renormalization, obstacles that decades of effort had not overcome. The Standard Model could not explain dark matter, the invisible substance that dominated the mass of galaxies, outweighing ordinary matter by factors of 5 or 6. Astronomical observations left no doubt that dark matter existed, and yet none of the Standard Model particles fit its properties. It had to be something new, something beyond the known roster. Nor could the Standard Model account for dark energy, the mysterious component causing the universe's expansion to accelerate, making up roughly 70% of the total energy density of the cosmos. This was completely outside the framework, unexplained, barely even addressed. The matter-antimatter asymmetry remained puzzling. The Standard Model predicted some asymmetry through CP violation in the weak force, but not nearly enough to explain why the universe contained matter and essentially no antimatter. Some additional mechanism, some new physics, seemed necessary. Neutrinos, once thought massless, had been shown through oscillation experiments to possess tiny but non-zero masses. They changed flavor as they traveled, electron neutrinos becoming muon or tau neutrinos and back, a quantum phenomenon requiring mass differences. Yet the Standard Model had no mechanism to give neutrinos mass, at least not in its original formulation, and there were aesthetic issues. 25 free parameters, masses and coupling strengths that had to be measured rather than predicted. Why did the top quark have one mass and the electron another? Why were the forces' strengths what they were? The Standard Model described these values but didn't explain them. Many physicists suspected that the Standard Model was an effective theory, accurate within a certain energy range, but ultimately an approximation of something deeper, more fundamental. Just as Newtonian mechanics emerged as an approximation to relativity at low speeds, perhaps the Standard Model emerged from a more complete theory at energies higher than current accelerators could reach. Theories beyond the Standard Model proliferated. Supersymmetry proposed that every fermion had a bosonic partner and vice versa, doubling the particle content but potentially explaining dark matter and stabilizing the Higgs mass. String theory suggested that particles were not point-like, but tiny vibrating strings, with different vibration modes corresponding to different particles, unifying all forces, including gravity, in a 10 or 11-dimensional framework. Extra dimensions, grand unified theories, Technicolor, Preon models, each offered potential solutions to some problems while introducing new questions, new predictions, new levels of complexity. But experiments at the Large Hadron Collider found nothing beyond the Higgs. No supersymmetric particles, no extra dimensions, no unexpected resonances. The data matched Standard Model predictions with almost unsettling precision, leaving physicists in the strange position of having a theory that worked beautifully but remained deeply unsatisfying. The frontier had shifted. No longer were physicists discovering new particles every few years. Instead, they refined measurements, constrained possibilities, searched for tiny deviations from predictions that might hint at new physics, looked to rare decays, subtle asymmetries, anomalies in muon magnetic moments or B-meson decays. And they looked outward to neutrino detectors buried in Antarctic ice or deep in Japanese mines, to gravitational wave observatories detecting ripples in space-time from colliding black holes, to dark matter detectors waiting in abandoned mines for the rare interaction of a dark matter particle with ordinary matter. The questions had changed from what particles exist to what lies beyond what we know, from discovering the next layer to understanding why this layer has the structure it does. Particle physics had reached a curious plateau. The standard model reigned supreme within its domain, tested to exquisite precision, confirmed in thousands of measurements, and yet everyone knew it was incomplete, a chapter in a longer story whose next pages remained unwritten. The field settled into a new rhythm, building more sensitive detectors, conducting longer experiments, analyzing data with greater sophistication, searching for the subtle, the rare, the unexpected, waiting for nature to reveal the next clue, the next anomaly that would point toward deeper truths. And in this waiting, in this patient observation, there emerged a different kind of understanding, not of new particles, but of the achievement already realized, the profound knowledge already won. From this vantage point, with the landscape of particle physics spread before us like a completed map of terra incognita, certain patterns emerge that transcend the mere catalogue of particles and forces. There is first the recurring theme of symmetry, woven through every level of understanding. Symmetries dictate which interactions can occur, which conservation laws must hold, which particles can transform into others. The mathematics of symmetry, group theory, becomes the language through which nature's preferences express themselves. When a theory possesses a symmetry, something remains unchanged under transformation, rotate space, and the laws of physics remain identical. Shift time forward or backward, and the equations hold their form. These symmetries, so abstract in mathematical expression, manifest as conservation laws, energy, momentum, angular momentum, the bedrock principles that govern every interaction. But particle physics revealed deeper symmetries, internal symmetries unrelated to space and time. The strong force, for instance, treats all quark colors identically: red, green, blue, arbitrary labels for symmetry that ensures gluons couple to color charge regardless of which color a quark carries. This SU3 symmetry, as mathematicians call it, generates the 8 gluons and determines their interactions. The electroweak force emerges from another symmetry, SU of 2 times U of 1, relating the electromagnetic and weak interactions, showing them as facets of a unified whole, only appearing separate because the symmetry is hidden, broken by the Higgs field, like a perfectly symmetric vase that falls and shatters. The pieces remember their origin, retain traces of the original form, but the symmetry is no longer manifest. This breaking of symmetry, this transition from unified to separated, likely occurred in the early universe when temperatures dropped below a critical threshold and the Higgs field acquired its non-zero value, condensing throughout space like dew forming on grass at dawn. In that moment, the unified electroweak force split. Particles acquired masses, and the universe took on the character we observe today. There is something profound in this, the apparent complexity, the different forces with different strengths and ranges, the hierarchy of particle masses. All this diversity emerges from symmetry breaking, from a kind of cosmic phase transition. The underlying reality is simpler, more unified, but hidden beneath the broken symmetry we inhabit. And then there is the matter of scale, the extraordinary range of magnitudes that particle physics encompasses. A proton measures roughly 1 femtometer across, 1/quadrillionth of a meter. Inside that proton, quarks are confined to even smaller scales, effectively point-like as far as experiments can tell, possibly smaller than 10 to the minus 19 meters, a billionth of a meter. Yet to study these infinitesimal objects, we build machines of enormous scale. The Large Hadron Collider's 27-kilometer ring, its thousands of magnets, its hundreds of millions of sensor channels, its energy budget matching a small city's, all this to probe distances so small that light itself crosses them in times measured in yoctoseconds, septillionths of a second. The disproportion seems almost comical, and yet it reflects a deep truth about nature. To see smaller, you need higher energy. Higher energy requires stronger fields, bigger accelerators, more elaborate detectors. The frontier of the small demands instruments of the large, linking the study of fundamental particles to engineering projects of monumental ambition. And there is the peculiar relationship between the very small and the very large, between particle physics and cosmology, the conditions that existed in the first moments after the Big Bang, when the universe was unimaginably hot and dense, can be recreated briefly in particle collisions. The quark-gluon plasma, a state of matter where quarks and gluons roam freely rather than being confined in protons and neutrons, existed throughout the cosmos for the first few microseconds, and now exists again for fleeting instants in heavy ion collisions at CERN and Brookhaven. The Higgs mechanism, which gives particles mass, operated differently in the early universe. At sufficiently high temperatures, the Higgs field vanished. Symmetry remained unbroken. Particles were massless. Only as the universe cooled did the field condense, the symmetry break, masses appear. Understanding particle physics thus becomes a way of understanding cosmic history. The relative abundances of elements, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the large-scale structure of galaxies, all these depend on particle interactions in the early universe, on cross-sections and decay rates and coupling constants measured in modern laboratories. We look inward to the smallest scales and find ourselves looking backward to the earliest times. The microscope becomes a telescope, peering not across space but across time, to moments when the universe fit within a volume smaller than an atom, when all the matter and energy we observe today existed in a state of almost incomprehensible density and temperature. There is also the role of uncertainty, not merely as experimental error, but as fundamental principle. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, the impossibility of simultaneously knowing both position and momentum with arbitrary precision, manifests throughout particle physics. It allows virtual particles to appear, borrowing energy for brief moments, mediating forces before dissolving back into the quantum foam. It permits quantum tunneling, where particles cross barriers they classically shouldn't penetrate, enabling nuclear fusion in stars and radioactive decay in unstable nuclei. The quantum vacuum, far from being empty, seethes with virtual particles, particle-antiparticle pairs constantly appearing and annihilating. The energy of this vacuum, calculated naively, comes out absurdly large, 120 orders of magnitude larger than the observed dark energy density. This vacuum catastrophe, this spectacular failure of prediction, remains one of physics' most embarrassing unsolved problems. And yet, the quantum vacuum has measurable effects. The Casimir effect, where two uncharged metal plates attract due to modified vacuum fluctuations between them. The Lamb shift, a tiny energy difference in hydrogen's spectrum caused by electron interactions with virtual photons. These confirm that the vacuum is not nothing, but a dynamic, fluctuating medium. Particle physics thus reveals a universe that is never still, never truly empty, never fully determinate, a universe where observation affects reality, where particles exist in superposition until measured, where the act of detection collapses possibility into actuality. Finally, there is the human dimension, easily overlooked amid equations and detector specifications. Thousands of physicists collaborate on single experiments, sharing data, co-authoring papers with author lists that scroll for pages. Their work requires patience, building detectors over decades, taking data for years, analyzing events that occur perhaps once in a trillion collisions. They develop new technologies that ripple outward into society: superconducting magnets, advanced computing, particle therapy for cancer, medical imaging, grid computing, the World Wide Web itself, invented at CERN to help physicists share data. All this emerges from the quest to understand nature's fundamental structure, and they pursue knowledge for its own sake, driven by curiosity about how things work, what the world is made of, why reality has the form it does. These questions have no immediate practical application, no quarterly earnings impact, no 5-year strategic value, and yet they represent something essential about human nature: the impulse to understand, to question, to seek patterns in apparent chaos. The story of particle physics is thus also a story about what it means to be human, to ask questions whose answers require generations to unfold, to build collaborations across borders and languages, to seek truth in the face of uncertainty, to pursue beauty in mathematical structure, to find meaning in understanding. And so we return to where we began, to the invisible realm beneath the surface of things, now perhaps with different eyes. The particles dancing in the quantum foam, the quarks confined within protons, the neutrinos streaming through the earth, the Higgs field permeating space, all these continue their ancient patterns, indifferent to observation, governed by laws that permit no exceptions. The electrons flowing through the circuit of the device reading these words, the quarks in the atoms of your body, the photons carrying signals, all participants in the same quantum dance described by the Standard Model, all following rules discovered through decades of patient inquiry. There is a kind of peace in this understanding and recognizing that beneath complexity lies pattern, beneath diversity lies unity, Beneath apparent chaos lies mathematical order. The universe, at its deepest explored level, consists of 12 matter particles, 4 force carriers, and 1 scalar boson, all interacting according to principles of symmetry and quantum mechanics. From this sparse inventory, everything emerges: atoms and molecules, chemistry and biology, stars and galaxies, consciousness and thought. We are quite literally made of particles whose properties were unknown a century ago, whose very existence was unsuspected for most of human history. The atoms in our bodies contain quarks that have been confined since the early universe, electrons that will outlast the stars. We are temporary patterns in a sea of quantum fields, arrangements of fundamental particles held together briefly by forces now understood in exquisite detail. And yet, for all this understanding, mystery remains. The Standard Model, complete in its domain, points beyond itself, hints at deeper structures, suggests questions it cannot answer: dark matter and dark energy, gravity and quantum mechanics, the hierarchy of masses, the number of generations. All these await explanations not yet found. Perhaps future accelerators will reveal new particles, new forces. Perhaps observations of cosmic rays or neutrinos or gravitational waves will provide the crucial clues. Perhaps the next breakthrough will come from unexpected directions, from mathematical insights or astronomical observations or careful reconsideration of existing data. Or perhaps we have reached the limits of what particle colliders can teach us. Perhaps the next layer lies at energies forever beyond our reach. Perhaps we must learn to extract truth from precision rather than discovery, from subtle measurements rather than dramatic new particles. Either way, the journey continues, the questions evolve, the patient work proceeds. In laboratories scattered across the world, detectors wait in the darkness, recording the rare, the subtle, the unexpected. Superconducting cavities accelerate particles to nearly light speed. Magnets bend their paths into collisions. Electronics capture the debris. Computers reconstruct events. Physicists analyze patterns, searching always for the anomaly, the deviation, the hint of something new. And in the quiet spaces between measurements, in the pauses between collisions, in the gaps between one discovery and the next, there is simply the particles themselves, existing as they always have, governed by principles that precede human understanding and will outlast it. The quarks and leptons, the bosons and fields, the symmetries and interactions, all continue their eternal dance, indifferent to names we give them, unconcerned with our theories, simply being what they are, following the rules written into the structure of reality itself. We have glimpsed that structure, traced its outlines, measured its parameters, built models that predict and explain, and in doing so, we have touched something fundamental, something true, something that transcends the particular moment and speaks to the underlying nature of everything. This is what particle physics offers: not certainty, not completion, but a map of the deepest territory yet explored, a description of the foundations upon which everything rests, a glimpse into the quantum realm where reality reveals its most basic character. And now, as the words slow, as the journey through the particle landscape draws towards its end, we can rest in that knowledge. Let it settle. Allow the patterns and principles to fade gently into the background, like stars disappearing at dawn, still present, still real, but receding from immediate view. The particles remain, doing what they have always done and what they will always do, existing at scales beyond sight, following laws beyond everyday experience, building from their simple interactions the entire complexity of the observable universe. And we have followed them into that hidden realm and returned, carrying with us perhaps a sense of wonder, an appreciation for the depth beneath the surface, and a quiet recognition that reality, at its foundation, is stranger and more beautiful than we ever imagined. The quantum fields vibrate on, the forces mediate, the symmetries hold, and the universe continues particle by particle, interaction by interaction, moment by moment, as it has and as it will, in patterns now partly known, partly understood, and partly still wrapped in mystery. The night is vast and still, and somewhere beyond the edges of waking thought, there exists a place where stories begin to echo one another, where myths separated by oceans and centuries seem to whisper the same truths in different tongues. I find myself wandering through this landscape tonight. Not a physical place, but a territory of the imagination, where the great narratives of humanity converge and overlap like shadows cast by the same distant light. This is the realm of comparative mythology, where the tales told around fires in ancient Mesopotamia somehow mirror the songs chanted in pre-Columbian temples, where flood myths rise from separate continents, where dying and resurrecting gods appear in cultures that never met, and where the same archetypal figures, the trickster, the great mother, the world tree, emerge again and again across the vast tapestry of human storytelling. The air here feels thick with possibility, with the weight of questions that have no single answer. What does it mean when peoples separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years tell versions of the same story, when the details shift but the skeleton remains, when the names change but the journey stays constant? Tonight I am simply observing, letting these patterns reveal themselves slowly, allowing the connections to surface like constellations becoming visible as the sky darkens. There is no hurry here, no need to grasp everything at once, only the gentle unfolding of recognition, the quiet pleasure of seeing how one myth illuminates another, how the Sumerian vision of the underworld casts new light on the Greek, how the Norse world tree and the Hindu cosmic pillar might be branches of the same ancient understanding. The scholars who first began to notice these patterns must have felt something like wonder, that particular thrill of discovering an invisible architecture. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as empires expanded and brought back stories from distant lands, as missionaries and merchants and adventurers returned with tales that sounded strangely familiar, the European mind began to ask new questions. Why does the hero's journey appear in Finnish epic poetry and in Polynesian legends? Why do so many cultures imagine a great deluge? Why does the number 3 carry such weight in folklore from Ireland to India? Some sought explanations in diffusion, the idea that stories traveled like seeds on the wind, carried by traders along the Silk Road, passed from sailor to sailor across the Mediterranean, borrowed and adapted and transformed as they moved from one culture to another. And certainly this happened. Stories do migrate. They cross borders and oceans. They change shape to fit new landscapes while retaining their essential core. But diffusion could not explain everything, could not account for why cultures with no possible contact, no shared trade routes, no common ancestry that could be traced, still told stories that resonated with uncanny similarity. And so other theories emerged, some more poetic, some more psychological, some reaching towards the fundamental structures of human consciousness itself. The landscape I'm moving through tonight contains all of these theories, holds them loosely, without insisting on certainty, because the beauty of comparative mythology lies not in final answers, but in the richness of the questions, in the way that placing myths side by side creates a kind of illumination, each story becoming a lens through which to view another. Consider the flood, that ancient catastrophe that appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Hebrew Bible, in Hindu scriptures, in Greek mythology, in stories from Australia and Mesoamerica and the Pacific Islands. The details vary: who survives, how they are warned, what they carry with them, why the waters came, but the essential pattern persists. A world-destroying deluge, a chosen few preserved, a new beginning rising from the wreckage of the old. Or consider the descent into the underworld, Inanna stripping off her regalia as she passes through 7 gates into the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. Persephone stolen into the dark kingdom of Hades, Orpheus seeking his lost Eurydice among the shades, Izanagi pursuing Izanami into the land of Yomi. The geography changes, the names shift, but the journey remains, a passage into darkness, a confrontation with death, a transformation or loss that marks the boundary between worlds. These patterns are not puzzles to be solved, but rather invitations to wonder, to recognize something about the way human beings make meaning, the way we tell ourselves into existence, the way we use narrative to contain what seems uncontainable, death and disaster, and the terrible beauty of transformation. Tonight I am content to simply move among these stories, to let them brush against each other, to notice where they converge and where they diverge, to feel the deep current that runs beneath them all. That current is what comparative mythology traces, the river of a narrative that flows through human consciousness, fed by 1,000 tributaries, each culture adding its own waters, its own minerals and colors, but all flowing in the same general direction, toward the ocean of meaning that lies somewhere beyond the horizon of any single tradition. The recognition that myths might be compared, that stories from distant cultures might illuminate one another, did not arrive suddenly, but emerged gradually across centuries, like a pattern becoming visible only when viewed from a certain distance. In the ancient world, travelers sometimes notice similarities between foreign gods and their own. Greek historians encountering Egyptian deities would say, "This is their Dionysus," or "This resembles our Artemis." But these were observations of convenience, translations to make the foreign intelligible, not yet the systematic study of pattern and structure. The Romans, inheriting Greek culture and expanding their reach across 3 continents, became adept at this identification. Jupiter was Zeus, Mars was Ares, and when they encountered Celtic or Germanic or Persian deities, they applied the same logic, seeking equivalences, finding correspondences. This was Interpretatio Romana, the practice of interpreting foreign gods through the lens of Roman religion. And while it flattened distinctions and missed nuances, it contained the seed of a crucial insight, that different peoples might be reaching towards similar divine archetypes. But true comparative mythology, the disciplined examination of narrative patterns across cultures, would have to wait for certain conditions to align. It required access to myths from genuinely distant traditions, translations of texts from languages most Europeans could not read, and a framework for thinking about culture and religion that allowed for comparison without immediate judgment. These elements began to converge only in the centuries following the Renaissance. When European exploration brought back stories from the Americas, when colonial expansion in Asia made Sanskrit texts available to Western scholars, when the study of ancient civilizations, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Persian, revealed mythologies older than Greece and Rome, the 17th century saw the first stirrings. Sir Thomas Browne in England pondered the universality of certain religious ideas. Isaac de la Pereire questioned whether all humanity descended from Adam, pointing to myths that seemed to predate biblical chronology. Bernard de Fontenelle in France suggested that myths arose from common human tendencies rather than historical events, that they were products of the imagination working in similar ways across different societies. These were provocative ideas in an age when most European scholars still assumed the Bible contained the definitive account of human origins, when deviation from that narrative could invite suspicion or worse. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment with its passion for classification, for finding universal laws, for discovering the hidden order beneath apparent chaos. Scholars began collecting myths the way naturalists collected specimens, arranging them, comparing them, seeking patterns. The French encyclopedists gathered stories from around the world. Charles de Brosse theorized about the origins of religion and fetishism. David Hume wrote of the natural history of religion, arguing that polytheism preceded monotheism, that human religious development followed observable stages. But the true transformation came with the encounter between European scholarship and the ancient texts of India, when British colonial officials in the late 1700s began to learn Sanskrit, when they translated the Vedas and the Upanishads, when they read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, they discovered something that shook the foundations of European historical understanding. These texts were old, astonishingly old, and they contained myths of great sophistication, cosmologies of breathtaking complexity, narratives that seemed both utterly foreign and strangely familiar. Sir William Jones, a British judge stationed in Calcutta, possessed a gift for languages and a passion for learning. In 1786, he delivered a lecture to the Asiatic Society that would echo through the next 2 centuries of scholarship. He had noticed something remarkable about Sanskrit. Its structure resembled Greek and Latin too closely to be coincidental. The roots of words, the patterns of grammar, the forms of verbs, all suggested a common origin, some ancient parent language from which these tongues had descended. This was the birth of Indo-European linguistics, the recognition that languages separated by vast distances might share deep ancestry, and with it came a new way of thinking about mythology. If languages descended from a common source, might myths do the same? Might the stories told in Vedic India and ancient Greece reflect narratives from some earlier culture, some primordial people whose descendants had carried their tales across continents? The 19th century seized upon this possibility with tremendous energy. German Romantic philosophers and philologists led the charge. Jacob Grimm, yes, one of the brothers Grimm devoted himself not just to collecting fairy tales, but to understanding their deeper patterns. He wrote massive comparative studies of mythology, tracing motifs across Germanic, Celtic, and classical traditions, seeking the original meanings buried beneath later elaborations. For Grimm and his contemporaries, comparative mythology was a kind of archaeology, digging through layers of narrative to reach the bedrock of ancient Indo-European religion. Max Müller, a German scholar working in England, became perhaps the most influential comparative mythologist of the century. His theory was both elegant and limiting. He believed that myths originated as poetic descriptions of natural phenomena, that primitive peoples personified the sun, the dawn, the storm, and that over time these metaphors hardened into narratives about gods and heroes. The story of Apollo, he argued, began as solar imagery. Athena emerged from descriptions of the dawn, Zeus from thunder and sky. Miller applied this solar mythology to everything, reducing complex narratives to weather poetry. And while his specific interpretations often strained credulity, his broader project was immensely productive. He translated the Rig Veda into English, introduced European readers to the richness of Vedic mythology, and insisted that myths from different cultures could be placed side by side, examined comparatively, understood as variations on common themes. His contemporary, Edward Burnett Tylor, approached mythology from a different angle. Tylor was an anthropologist, fascinated by what he called primitive culture. He proposed that mythology arose from early humans trying to explain their experiences. Dreams, he suggested, led to beliefs about spirits and souls. Observations of death and trance states inspired ideas about the afterlife. Myths were essentially proto-science, attempts to account for phenomena that primitive peoples could not yet explain rationally. This animism theory had its own limitations. It assumed a hierarchy of cultural development with European rationalism at the apex, and it often misread complex symbolic systems as simple errors of reasoning, but it contributed something crucial to comparative mythology, the idea that similar myths might arise independently, not through diffusion or common ancestry, but through similar cognitive processes. Human beings everywhere dreamed, everywhere faced death, everywhere wondered about the sun and moon and stars. And so they developed similar narrative responses to these universal experiences. Meanwhile, James Frazer was constructing his monumental work, The Golden Bough. Initially published in 1890 as 2 volumes, it eventually expanded into 12 volumes of comparative mythology and ritual. Frazer gathered myths from an astounding range of cultures, from Scotland to Polynesia, from ancient Rome to contemporary Africa, and he wove them into a grand theory about the evolution of human thought, from magic to religion to science. At the heart of Frazer's work was the dying god, the figure who sacrifices himself for the fertility of the land and is reborn. He found this pattern everywhere, in Osiris and Dionysus and Attis and Adonis, in the vegetative cycles celebrated in agricultural festivals, in the sacred kingship rituals where rulers were symbolically or actually killed to renew the world. Frazer saw these myths as survivals from an earlier stage of human development, remnants of ancient fertility cults preserved in the narratives of more sophisticated civilizations. The Golden Bough was enormously influential. It shaped how generations of readers thought about mythology, inspired poets like T.S. Eliot and novelists like D.H. Lawrence, and established comparative mythology as a serious, scholarly endeavor. But it also embodied the problems of its era. Fraser never left his study, never visited most of the cultures he wrote about, relied on secondhand accounts from missionaries and colonial administrators, and imposed his own evolutionary framework onto stories that might have meant something entirely different to the people who told them. By the turn of the 20th century, comparative mythology had become an established field, with competing schools and methodologies. Some scholars emphasized diffusion, tracing how stories migrated along trade routes. Others focused on independent invention, arguing that similar myths arose from similar human needs. Still others pursued the linguistic approach, using Indo-European philology to reconstruct ancient narratives, and a new generation was beginning to question the assumptions of their predecessors, to challenge the evolutionary hierarchies, to insist on understanding myths within their specific cultural contexts rather than as fragments of some universal system. The early phase had laid the foundation, had gathered an enormous archive of narratives from around the world, had established that comparison was possible and potentially illuminating, but it had also revealed how easily comparison could become reduction, how the search for universal patterns could flatten the particular, how myths could be torn from their contexts and forced into ill-fitting theories. The scholars who would follow would have to navigate between these dangers, seeking connections without erasing differences, finding patterns without losing sight of the specific, honoring both the universal and the particular in humanity's endless work of storytelling. The 20th century arrived with its wars and upheavals, its shattering of old certainties, and with it came new ways of thinking about the human mind, about symbolism, about the stories we tell and why we tell them. Sigmund Freud had already begun mapping the unconscious, revealing how hidden desires and fears shaped behavior, and it was only a matter of time before this psychological lens turned toward mythology. Freud himself made the connection explicit. He saw myths as collective dreams, expressions of universal psychological conflicts. The story of Oedipus was not simply an ancient Greek tragedy, but a map of childhood development, the son's unconscious desire for the mother, the rivalry with the father, themes that Freud believed recurred across cultures because they reflected fundamental human experiences. Myths, in this view, were the dreams of entire peoples, symbolic narratives encoding truths too dangerous or difficult to express directly. But it was Carl Jung who would transform comparative mythology most profoundly. Jung broke with Freud in 1912, and in the years that followed, he developed a vision of the psyche far more expansive than his mentors. Jung proposed the existence of a collective unconscious, a deep layer of the mind shared by all humanity, populated not by personal memories but by archetypes, universal patterns of thought and imagery that manifested across cultures and epochs. The archetypes revealed themselves in myths. The Great Mother appeared in Isis and Demeter and Kali, in the earth goddesses of indigenous peoples, in the Virgin Mary, always shifting form but retaining essential characteristics, nurturing and devouring, creative and destructive, source of life and gateway to death. The hero's journey unfolded in countless variations. A young person called to adventure, facing trials, descending into darkness, emerging transformed. This pattern appeared in Gilgamesh and Odysseus, in the Buddha's enlightenment quest, in the vision quests of Native American traditions, in the fairy tales collected by the Brothers Grimm. Jung traveled widely, studied Eastern philosophy, examined alchemical texts, explored Gnostic gospels, and everywhere he looked, he found these recurring symbols. The mandala, a circular form representing wholeness, appeared in Tibetan Buddhism and medieval Christian art, and the sand paintings of the Navajo. The trickster, a boundary-crossing figure who disrupted order and revealed hidden truths, emerged as Loki and Anansi and Coyote and Hermes, as the holy fools of Russian Orthodoxy and the clowns of indigenous ceremonies. For Jung, these patterns were not borrowed or diffused, but arose spontaneously from the structure of the human psyche itself. They were as inherent to consciousness as the ability to perceive depth or recognize faces, and myths were the language through which the unconscious communicated with the conscious mind, offering guidance, warning of dangers, pointing toward integration and wholeness. This Jungian framework electrified comparative mythology. It offered a way to understand similarities without resorting to either diffusion or evolutionary stages. It treated myths as psychologically sophisticated rather than primitive, and it suggested that studying mythology was not merely an academic exercise, but a path to self-understanding. Joseph Campbell would later build his entire career on this foundation, tracing the monomyth, the single great story that all heroic narratives supposedly shared. But Jung's influence extended far beyond any single scholar. While Jung was exploring the collective unconscious, another revolution was unfolding in France. Claude Lévi-Strauss, an anthropologist trained in philosophy, began applying structural linguistics to mythology. His insight was radical. Myths should be read not as linear narratives but as structures, as systems of relationships between elements. What mattered was not the surface story, but the underlying patterns, the way myths organized oppositions, nature versus culture, Ross versus cooked, life versus death. Lévi-Strauss analyzed myths from indigenous peoples of the Americas with extraordinary rigor. He broke stories down into their constituent units, their mythemes, and arranged these units in grids and charts, revealing how different versions of a myth all addressed the same fundamental contradictions. A Tsimshian story about a man who married a bear woman, a Haida tale about salmon people, an Ojibwe narrative about the origin of death. These were not random stories, but transformations of each other, variations on structural themes, different ways of mediating the same impossible paradoxes that haunted human existence. For Lévi-Strauss, comparative mythology was less about finding universal archetypes and more about understanding how the human mind structures experience. Myths were tools for thinking, ways of making the contradictions of existence bearable by encoding them in narrative form. And because all human minds operated according to similar structural principles, because binary opposition and mediation were fundamental cognitive operations, myths from different cultures would inevitably share structural similarities even without any historical connection. This structuralist approach could be dizzying in its complexity. Lévi-Strauss's 4-volume Mythologies traced transformations across hundreds of myths from North and South America, following motifs as they twisted and inverted, as elements from one story became their opposites in another, as Honey in one myth corresponded to poison in another, as a bird in one tale transformed into a fish in the next. The work required extraordinary patience, a willingness to surrender linear storytelling for structural analysis. But for those who followed his method, it revealed an architecture of thought underlying the world's mythologies. Meanwhile, the study of ancient Near Eastern texts was revolutionizing understanding of biblical and classical mythology. Archaeologists had been excavating Mesopotamian sites since the 1800s, and as tablets were deciphered, as Sumerian and Akkadian texts became readable, scholars discovered narratives that predated and paralleled biblical stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh contained a flood narrative strikingly similar to Noah's. The Enuma Elish described a creation through divine combat that echoed in Genesis and Babylonian traditions. Myths of dying gods in Sumerian religion prefigured later Mediterranean cults. These discoveries complicated simple diffusionist theories. Yes, stories had clearly traveled. Hebrew scribes had encountered Babylonian myths during the exile. Greek colonists had absorbed Egyptian and Phoenician narratives, but the relationships were intricate. Stories were not simply copied, but transformed, adapted to new theological frameworks, reinterpreted through different cultural lenses. A Sumerian myth about Inanna's descent might influence later stories, but each retelling carried its own meanings, its own concerns, its own vision of the divine. Georges Dumézil added another layer to comparative mythology in the mid-20th century. Working within the Indo-European framework, he proposed a tripartite ideology underlying the myths and social structures of Indo-European peoples, a division into three functions: sovereignty and sacred power, physical force and warrior prowess, fertility and productivity. This pattern appeared in the three castes of ancient India, in the Roman division between Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, in the Norse pantheon structure, in the three estates of medieval European society. Dumézil's work was meticulous, comparing not just myths but rituals, social organization, linguistic evidence, tracing how this threefold pattern persisted even as Indo-European peoples migrated and diverged. His theories became controversial, tangled with politics, accused of essentialism, but they demonstrated how comparative mythology could illuminate not just stories but entire worldviews, ways of organizing reality that persisted across millennia. Mircea Eliade brought yet another perspective, trained in the history of religions, deeply influenced by his Romanian Orthodox background and his years in India. Eliade argued that myths expressed a longing for sacred time, for the moment of creation when the world was fresh and full of power. Religious rituals reenacted these primordial events, allowed participants to step outside ordinary time and reconnect with the eternal. The myths of indigenous Australians, of ancient Mesopotamians, of medieval Christians, all revealed this pattern, this desire to return to the beginning, to participate in the founding gestures that made the world meaningful. For Eliade, the differences between myths mattered less than what they shared, a sense of the sacred as a realm apart from profane existence, an understanding that certain times and places and actions connected to ultimate reality. He wrote of Axis Mundi, the world center, appearing as mountain or tree or temple, the point where earth and heaven met. This image recurred everywhere: Mount Olympus and Mount Meru, Yggdrasil and the Christian cross, the Kaaba and the Temple of Jerusalem, each culture locating its own sacred center, its own connection to transcendent meaning. By mid-century, comparative mythology had become extraordinarily rich and complex. Multiple methodologies coexisted: psychological and structural and philological and phenomenological. Each revealed different patterns, different connections, different insights into humanity's myth-making impulse. And the archive kept expanding as anthropologists documented myths from Amazonian peoples and Pacific Islanders, as translations made African and Asian narratives more widely available, as scholars revisited familiar myths with new questions and methods. The field had moved far beyond its origins in European colonialism and evolutionary theory, though it still carried some of that baggage, still struggled with questions of cultural appropriation and interpretive authority, still had to navigate between the universal and the particular, between finding patterns and respecting differences. But it had also become indispensable for anyone seeking to understand how human beings make meaning, how we tell ourselves into existence, how we use story to contain the uncontainable mysteries of birth and death and transformation. The myths themselves remained inexhaustible. Each reading revealed new depths. Each comparison illuminated new connections. The Babylonian Ishtar and the Greek Aphrodite were not identical, but placing them side by side revealed something about how different cultures imagined divine love and desire. The creation stories of the Maori and the Maya followed different logics, but both grappled with the fundamental question of how something emerged from nothing. The trickster tales of West Africa and the Pacific Northwest took different forms, but both explored the creative and destructive power of boundary crossing. And so comparative mythology entered its mature phase, a discipline aware of its own limitations, conscious of the dangers of reductionism, yet still committed to the essential work of seeing connections, of placing myths in conversation with one another, of discovering what they might reveal about the human condition. The late 20th century brought new voices, scholars from outside the European tradition who challenged the frameworks that had dominated the field. They pointed out that comparative mythology had largely been a Western enterprise imposed on non-Western narratives, reading them through foreign lenses, seeking patterns that confirmed European theories while ignoring meanings that mattered to the cultures that created the myths. Indigenous scholars began reclaiming their own narratives, insisting on their complexity and specificity, refusing the reduction of living traditions to specimens in a comparative catalog. Wendy Doniger, working primarily with Hindu mythology, demonstrated how comparison could honor difference while still illuminating pattern. She showed how the same myth could carry multiple meanings, how stories transformed as they moved through time and across regions, how what looked like the same narrative in two cultures might actually serve entirely different functions. Her work on myths of doubling and splitting, on the fluidity of identity in Hindu stories, revealed interpretive possibilities that earlier comparative mythologists had missed. The feminist revision of a mythology proved equally transformative. Scholars like Maria Gimbutas re-examined archaeological evidence from Neolithic Europe, proposing a culture centered on goddess worship, challenging the assumption that patriarchal pantheons were universal or inevitable. Others revisited familiar myths to recover suppressed feminine perspectives. Medusa was not simply a monster, but perhaps a powerful goddess demonized by patriarchal mythmakers. Lilith was not just Adam's rebellious first wife, but a complex figure with roots in Mesopotamian religion. These rereadings were controversial, sometimes criticized for projecting modern concerns onto ancient narratives, but they opened comparative mythology to questions it had long ignored. Meanwhile, the cognitive science of religion was emerging, drawing on psychology, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology to understand why humans create myths at all. Pascal Boyer and others proposed that myths succeeded because they violated intuitive expectations in memorable ways. A God who knows everything violates our assumptions about minds requiring sensory input. A talking animal violates our categories of what can speak. These minimally counterintuitive concepts stuck in memory, spread easily, and became the building blocks of mythological systems. This approach offered new explanations for why certain motifs recurred, not because of archetypes in the collective unconscious or structural operations of the mind, but because human cognition had certain universal features. We all possessed theory of mind, the ability to imagine what others were thinking, and this made anthropomorphic gods intuitive across cultures. We all had agency detection systems, evolved to spot predators and allies, and these sometimes misfired in ways that generated beliefs in spirits and invisible beings. Myths exploited these cognitive biases, these quirks of how our brains processed information. The cognitive approach was rigorously empirical, testable in ways that earlier theories were not, but it also felt reductive to many. It could explain why a concept was memorable, but not what it meant to the people who transmitted it, why a story spread, but not why it mattered. And so comparative mythology found itself pulled between scientific precision and interpretive depth, between explaining mechanisms and understanding meanings. The digital age brought its own revolution. Suddenly, scholars could search thousands of texts instantaneously, could map narrative motifs across databases, could use computational methods to trace relationships between stories. The Arne Thompson Uther Index, a classification system for folktales, could now be analyzed statistically, revealing patterns invisible to individual readers. Phylogenetic methods borrowed from evolutionary biology could track how myths diverged and evolved, suggesting which versions were older, which had influenced others. These tools were powerful, but they raised questions too. Could myths be reduced to data points? Could computational analysis capture what made a story meaningful? Or was something essential lost when narrative became algorithm, when the lived experience of myth dissolved into statistical correlation? The debate echoed older tensions, but with new urgency in an age increasingly dominated by quantification and big data. Some comparative mythologists turned toward contemporary expressions, examining how ancient patterns persisted in modern storytelling. The hero's journey appeared in Star Wars and Harry Potter, the dying god in superhero comics, trickster energy, and countercultural movements. This work bridged academic study and popular culture, showed that mythic thinking had not disappeared but merely changed costume, that the archetypes Jung identified still shaped how stories resonated, still connected with something deep in the collective imagination. Others pursued cross-cultural philosophy, using myths as resources for thinking about perennial questions. What is the relationship between fate and free will? How do we understand suffering? What does it mean to live well? Greek tragedy and Hindu epics and Buddhist Jataka tales all grappled with these questions, and placing them in dialogue created a kind of global conversation, a comparative wisdom tradition that no single culture could claim as its own. The field also became more reflexive, more aware of its own history. Scholars examined how comparative mythology had been entangled with colonialism, how it had served to justify European dominance by ranking cultures on evolutionary ladders, how it had appropriated sacred narratives and treated them as raw material for theory building. This reckoning was painful but necessary. It meant acknowledging that comparison always involved power, that placing myths side by side was never innocent, that the frameworks used to organize and interpret carried assumptions about what was normal, what was primitive, what was universal, and yet the impulse to compare persisted because myths genuinely did echo one another, because the parallels were too striking to ignore. The challenge was to compare responsibly, to seek patterns without erasing particularity, to honor the specificity of each tradition while remaining open to resonance and connection. This required a kind of double vision, holding similarity and difference simultaneously, refusing easy synthesis while still allowing for genuine dialogue. Some scholars proposed polythetic categories, defining mythic patterns not by a single essential feature, but by a cluster of characteristics. Any given myth might share some features with others in the category while lacking others. This approach allowed for family resemblances without requiring perfect correspondence. The flood myths could be grouped together based on overlapping elements, destruction, preservation, renewal, without insisting that all shared every detail. It was messier than earlier typologies, but truer to the actual diversity of mythological expression. The question of origins remained perpetually unresolved. Did myths reveal ancient historical events? Were they remnants of primitive science? Did they encode psychological truths? Were they structural transformations, products of cognitive evolution? All of these theories contained insights. None could account for everything. Perhaps myths were all of these things and more, layered creations that accumulated meaning over time, serving different functions in different contexts, carrying multiple messages simultaneously. What became clear was that comparative mythology was not a puzzle to be solved, but a practice to be refined, an ongoing conversation between traditions, a way of thinking that illuminated without exhausting, that revealed patterns without reducing complexity. The scholar approaching myths now had to be many things at once: philologist and anthropologist, historian and psychologist, attentive to context and open to pattern, rooted in specificity and willing to see connection. The myths themselves endured, still told, still adapted, still resonating in ways that defied complete explanation. New versions emerged. Old versions were rediscovered. Translations opened texts to readers who had never encountered them, and the work of comparison continued, not to prove a grand unified theory, not to reduce all myths to one, but to create spaces where different visions of the sacred could meet, where stories separated by ocean and epoch could illuminate one another, where the particular and the universal danced together in productive tension. The twilight of the 20th century found comparative mythology transformed, humbled by its past mistakes, enriched by new methods and voices, more cautious in its claims, but no less committed to its essential work. The field had learned to live with uncertainty, to embrace complexity, to resist the temptation of overly neat explanations. And in this maturity, it found new vitality, new questions to ask, new connections to explore, new ways of honoring the inexhaustible creativity of human myth-making. The journey from William Jones's lecture in Calcutta to the contemporary moment spanned more than 2 centuries, moved through multiple theoretical frameworks, engaged with myths from every inhabited continent, and what it revealed was not a single pattern underlying all stories, not a master key that unlocked every narrative, but something both more modest and more profound, an understanding that human beings everywhere tell stories to make sense of existence, and that these stories, while rooted in particular times and places, sometimes speak to one another across the boundaries of culture and history, whispering of shared wonder, shared fear, shared longing for meaning in a mysterious cosmos. And now, in the quietest hours, when the mind drifts between waking and something else, the myths begin to speak in their own voices, no longer specimens to be catalogued or patterns to be decoded, but living presences, breathing stories that have survived because they contain something essential, something that cannot be paraphrased or explained away. Consider what it means that flood stories appear on every continent, in cultures that never touched, never traded, never knew of each other's existence. The Matsya Purana tells of Manu warned by a fish, building a ship to survive the deluge. The Popol Vuh speaks of humanity destroyed by a great rain, only wooden people surviving before the final creation. Aboriginal Australians remember the waters rising, swallowing the land. This repetition might have rational explanations, memories of local floods amplified into cosmic catastrophe, rising sea levels at the end of ice ages preserved in oral tradition. But the myths themselves don't care about such explanations. They carry the terror of dissolution, the hope of renewal, the question of what deserves to be saved when everything else is lost, or consider the worldwide presence of the world tree, Yggdrasil, in Norse cosmology, its roots reaching into underworld realms, its branches supporting the heavens, birds nesting in its crown, serpents coiling around its base. The Mayans knew the ceiba tree as the axis connecting earth and sky. Siberian shamans climbed cosmic trees in their journeys between worlds. Hindu tradition speaks of the banyan as the eternal tree, with roots above and branches below. These are not the same tree, not even describing the same botanical reality, but they all imagine vertical connection, a living ladder between realms, a channel through which energy and beings flow up and down. And perhaps what they reveal is something about how consciousness experiences itself, rooted yet reaching, anchored yet aspiring, contained within a body yet sensing something beyond. The dying god appears again and again, Osiris torn apart and reassembled, Dionysus ripped to pieces by Titans and reborn, Balder killed by mistletoe and mourned until Ragnarok, Tammuz descending to the underworld, Corn Mother sacrificed so that maize might grow. These deaths are not endings but transformations. The god's suffering produces fertility, renewal, continuation. The pattern connects to agriculture. Yes, to the cycles of planting and harvest, but it speaks to something deeper too, the necessity of sacrifice, the way that life feeds on life, the terrible beauty of transformation through dissolution, and everywhere the trickster, That boundary-crossing figure who refuses category, coyote and raven on the northwest coast, stealing fire or releasing salmon, creating the world through mischief and accident, Anansi the spider in West African and Caribbean tales, weaving stories and trapping the powerful in their own words, Loki in the Norse cosmos, shape-shifting and scheming, father of monsters and ultimately the catalyst for the world's ending and renewal, Hermes in Greece, messenger and thief, guide of souls and patron of liars. These figures are neither good nor evil, neither creator nor destroyer, but something that exceeds such binaries. They remind us that order requires chaos, that creation needs disruption, that the sacred and the profane cannot be cleanly separated. What comparative mythology reveals, when approached with humility and wonder, is not that all myths are the same, but that human consciousness works with similar materials, faces similar mysteries, and generates similar symbols in response. We all experience the cycle of seasons, the mystery of growth and decay. We all watch the sun disappear and wonder if it will return. We all face death and need stories that make it meaningful. We all exist between earth and sky, animal and divine, nature and culture, and we all create narratives to navigate these impossible positions. The myths don't explain reality so much as make it inhabitable. They transform raw experience into something shaped, something that can be held and passed on. A child dies and there is only grief, unbearable grief, but a myth of the underworld journey, of the soul's passage to another realm, of the possibility of eventual reunion, makes the grief something that can be lived with, not less painful, but less purely annihilating. A drought threatens starvation, and there is only fear, but a myth of the rain, God's displeasure. Rituals that might appease, a narrative framework that makes the crisis comprehensible, transforms helpless terror into purposeful action, and so the myths endure, changing form but persisting in essence, migrating from oral tradition to written text to digital media, finding new expression in novels and films and video games. The hero's journey that once shaped epic poetry now structures Hollywood blockbusters. The descent to the underworld that appeared in ancient Sumerian hymns now unfolds in contemporary fantasy novels. The trickster who disrupted divine order in traditional tales now manifests in countercultural art and subversive comedy. This continuity suggests something about the human need for myth. We are not simply rational beings processing information. We are meaning-making creatures, storytelling animals who understand our lives narratively. We don't just experience events, we implot them, connect them into sequences, find patterns, create characters and quests and transformations. And the old myths provide templates, archetypal patterns that help us shape our own stories, recognize our own journeys, find meaning in our own struggles. Comparative mythology, at its best, creates a space where these patterns can be seen clearly, where the myths of different peoples can illuminate one another without erasing their distinctiveness, where we can honor both the universal human predicament and the particular cultural responses. It's a practice of attention, of careful listening, of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, of finding connection without insisting on identity. The work is never finished. New myths emerge. Old myths reveal new meanings. Translations open previously inaccessible narratives. Scholars ask new questions and discover new patterns, and the fundamental mystery remains. Why do we tell these stories? What do they reveal about consciousness itself? How do narratives shape reality even as they claim to describe it? These questions have no final answers, only deepening inquiry, only the ongoing practice of attending to the myths and letting them speak. And so the night deepens, and the stories continue their endless circulation, moving through minds and cultures, changing and persisting, dying and being reborn, like the gods they describe. I find myself returning to where this began, to the recognition of pattern, the echo across distance, the way one story seems to answer another, though centuries and oceans separate them. But now there's less urgency to explain, less need to reduce the mystery to mechanism, only a quiet appreciation for the fact of it, this human capacity to imagine, to narrate, to find meaning in the chaos of existence. The myths are still being told tonight, somewhere, in a grandmother's voice teaching a child the old stories, in a temple where ancient rituals continue, in a writer's imagination as new versions take shape, in a scholar's study where texts from different traditions sit side by side, in a reader encountering a story for the first time and feeling that strange recognition, the sense of having always known this, of meeting something familiar in an unfamiliar form. This is what comparative mythology preserves, not answers, but connections, not certainty, but resonance. It shows us that we are not alone in our wondering, that others before us faced the same mysteries and created beauty in response, that the human imagination working on the fundamental questions of existence will generate similar symbols, similar narratives, similar visions of the sacred. This continuity suggests something about the human need for myth. We are not simply rational beings processing information. We are meaning-making creatures, storytelling animals who understand our lives narratively. We don't just experience events, we implot them, connect them into sequences, find patterns, create characters and quests and transformations. And the old myths provide templates, archetypal patterns that help us shape our own stories, recognize our own journeys, find meaning in our own struggles. Comparative mythology, at its best, creates a space where these patterns can be seen clearly, where the myths of different peoples can illuminate one another without erasing their distinctiveness, where we can honor both the universal human predicament and the particular cultural responses. It's a practice of attention, of careful listening, of holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, of finding connection without insisting on identity. The work is never finished. New myths emerge. Old myths reveal new meanings. Translations open previously inaccessible narratives. Scholars ask new questions and discover new patterns. And the fundamental mystery remains. Why do we tell these stories? What do they reveal about consciousness itself? How do narratives shape reality even as they claim to describe it? These questions have no final answers, only deepening inquiry, only the ongoing practice of attending to the myths and letting them speak. And so the night deepens, and the stories continue their endless circulation, moving through minds and cultures, changing and persisting, dying and being reborn, like the gods they describe. I find myself returning to where this began, to the recognition of pattern, the echo across distance, The way one story seems to answer another, though centuries and oceans separate them. But now there's less urgency to explain, less need to reduce the mystery to mechanism, only a quiet appreciation for the fact of it, this human capacity to imagine, to narrate, to find meaning in the chaos of existence. The myths are still being told tonight, somewhere, in a grandmother's voice teaching a child the old stories, in a temple where ancient rituals continue, in a writer's imagination as new versions take shape, in a scholar's study where texts from different traditions sit side by side, in a reader encountering a story for the first time and feeling that strange recognition, the sense of having always known this, of meeting something familiar in an unfamiliar form. This is what comparative mythology preserves, not answers, but connections, not certainty, but resonance. It shows us that we are not alone in our wondering, that others before us faced the same mysteries and created beauty in response, that the human imagination working on the fundamental questions of existence will generate similar symbols, similar narratives, similar visions of the sacred.